The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of Arizona dust, and Lydia Mercer stepped into her new life, only to discover her groom was already dead. Shot 3 days ago, they said. Water rights, they whispered. The tall cowboy with storm-gray eyes who met her wasn't Elijah Ward. He was Colt Ashford, and the way he looked at her made something dangerous stir in her chest. They called her a mail-order bride. He called her mine before she ever left town. Stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as the Wells Fargo stagecoach rattled into Apache Junction, kicking up plumes of ochre dust that settled like a fine shroud over everything it touched. Lydia Mercer pressed her gloved hand against the window frame, her other hand clutching the worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned in this world. 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of parents long gone, and the carefully folded letters from Elijah Ward, the man she'd traveled 3 weeks to marry. Her bones ached from the journey. Her skin felt gritty despite her best efforts to remain presentable. But her spine was straight, her chin lifted with a determination that had carried her from Philadelphia to this God-forsaken territory where everything shimmered with heat and possibility. The coach shuddered to a final stop, and Lydia took a steadying breath. Through the dust-hazed window, she could make out the rough-hewn buildings lining the main street. A general store, a saloon with swinging doors, a church with a modest steeple, and clusters of people who had paused in their daily routines to watch the stage arrive. "Apache Junction," the driver called, his voice hoarse from road dust and whiskey. "End of the line, miss." Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment she'd been simultaneously anticipating and dreading since she'd answered Elijah's advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer 3 months ago. Rancher seeks respectable woman for marriage, must be strong of character and willing to build a life in the Arizona territory. No delicate sensibilities need apply. She'd read those words 100 times, memorizing every letter, wondering what kind of man would advertise for a wife like one might advertise for livestock. But desperation made beggars of proud women, and after losing her teaching position when the school board discovered her boarding house was located in a questionable neighborhood, Lydia had few options left. An orphan with no family, no prospects, and a reputation tarnished by circumstances beyond her control, Elijah's offer had seemed like Providence itself. The driver opened the door, and the heat rushed in like something alive. Lydia gathered her skirts and stepped down onto the wooden platform, her button boots clicking against the weathered planks. She blinked against the brilliant sunlight, one hand rising to shield her eyes as she searched the small crowd for the face she'd memorized from the single photograph Elijah had sent. But the crowd was already whispering. She could feel their stares, hear the murmurs that seemed to carry on the hot wind. "That's her. Poor thing. All this way for nothing." Lydia's stomach clenched. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. A figure separated from the shadow of the general store's awning. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a predator's easy grace. He wore dusty denim pants, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing tanned, corded forearms, and a dark hat pulled low over his eyes. A gun belt rode his hips with the comfortable weight of familiarity. He stopped 3 feet from her, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Lydia's breath caught despite herself. This wasn't Elijah. Elijah's photograph had shown a softer man, rounder in the face, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This man was all sharp angles and hard planes, his jaw carved from granite, his mouth set in a firm line that suggested he smiled about as often as it rained in this desert. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. Storm gray and intense, they studied her with an assessment that felt almost physical, as though he could see past her travel-worn dress and dusty bonnet straight through to her bones. "Miss Mercer." His voice was low, rough as gravel, but not unkind. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that fell across his forehead. "I'm Colt Ashford. I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances." Lydia's mouth went dry. "Where is Elijah?" The question hung in the scorching air between them. Around them, the whispers intensified. Lydia was vaguely aware of faces pressed against windows, of people pretending not to stare while hanging on every word. Colt's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the tanned skin. He glanced at the crowd, then back at her, and something shifted in those gray eyes, a flash of what might have been sympathy or anger or both. "Not here," he said quietly. "Let me get your trunk." "Where is Elijah?" Lydia repeated, louder this time, her voice carrying across the platform. She'd come too far, endured too much to be put off with evasions. "I've traveled 3 weeks to marry him. I have his letters, his promise." "Miss Mercer." Colt stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone only she could hear. "Please, let me collect your belongings and I'll explain everything, but not here. Not like this." There was something in his face, a genuine distress that cut through her rising panic. Lydia found herself nodding, despite every instinct screaming at her to demand answers immediately. "I have only the one trunk," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "The brown leather one." Colt nodded and moved to help the driver wrestle her battered trunk from the top of the coach. Lydia stood frozen on the platform, intensely aware of every eye upon her, every whisper that seemed to dissect her appearance, her situation, her very worth. "Mail-order bride," she heard someone mutter. The words dripped with judgment and pity in equal measure. "Come all this way for nothing. What'll she do now? Poor creature. No family, no money, stranded in Apache Junction." Lydia lifted her chin higher, blinking back the hot sting of tears she refused to shed in front of these strangers. She'd survived worse than gossip. She'd survived the poorhouse after her parents died, survived the lecherous boarding house keeper who'd cost her her position, survived the cold charity of distant relatives who'd made it clear she was an unwelcome burden. She would survive this too, whatever this turned out to be. Colt returned, her trunk hoisted easily on his shoulder as though it weighed nothing. "My horse is just there," he said, nodding toward a magnificent black stallion tied outside the saloon. "It's not far to where you'll be staying." "Where I'll be staying?" Lydia repeated, but Colt was already moving, and she found herself following because what else could she do? She had no money for return passage, knew no one in this town, and the heat was making her head swim. Colt secured her trunk, then turned back to her. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with something, his brow furrowing, then he held out his hand. "I'll walk you there," he said. "It's too hot to ride, and you look about ready to collapse." Lydia wanted to protest that she was perfectly fine, but the truth was her legs had gone shaky and her vision was beginning to blur at the edges. She placed her gloved hand in his, feeling the callous strength of his palm, even through the fabric. They walked in silence down the main street, Colt leading his horse with one hand while Lydia's hand remained in his other. The town watched them pass, merchants pausing in doorways, women whispering behind fans, children stopping their games to stare. Lydia kept her gaze forward, her back straight despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. The boarding house sat at the end of the street, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and lace curtains in the windows. A hand-painted sign read, "Mrs. Calloway's Respectable Lodging for Ladies." Colt tied his horse at the rail and turned to Lydia. His face was grave, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Miss Mercer," he began, then seemed to reconsider. "Lydia. May I call you Lydia?" She nodded mutely, her heart now hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Elijah Ward is dead." The words were simple, direct, devastating. Lydia felt them hit her chest like a physical blow. The world tilted, and suddenly Colt's hands were on her shoulders, steadying her, his face close to hers. "I've got you," he said quietly. "Breathe. Just breathe." Lydia dragged in air that felt thick as wool. "Dead," she whispered. "How?" "Shot 3 days ago." Colt's jaw clenched again, that muscle jumping. "Water rights dispute with Magnus Sloan, the biggest landowner in the territory. Elijah had a small ranch about 5 miles north of town, right along Cooper's Creek. Sloan wanted the water access. Elijah refused to sell." "So he killed him?" Lydia's voice rose, horror and rage mixing in equal measure. "Nothing could be proved. Sloan's men claim Elijah drew first in a fair fight. There were witnesses, all on Sloan's payroll." Colt's eyes darkened with barely suppressed fury. The sheriff couldn't make anything stick. Lydia pulled away from his steadying grip, wrapping her arms around herself despite the heat. "Why didn't you send a telegram? Why let me come all this way?" "There wasn't time. Elijah was shot on Monday. He died Tuesday morning. By the time anyone thought to check his papers and found your letters, you were already on your way. We sent a wire to every stop along your route, but Colt shook his head. You were always one day ahead of the messages. So I've come 3 weeks across this godforsaken desert to marry a dead man. Lydia laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that bordered on hysteria. I gave up everything, spent every penny I had on the journey, and now... Her voice broke. She pressed her gloved hand to her mouth, fighting for control. She would not cry. She would not fall apart on this stranger's porch while half the town watched from behind their curtains. Now I'm stranded, she finished, her voice barely a whisper. Colt was silent for a long moment. When Lydia finally gathered the courage to look at him, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something intense and searching, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle written in her face. You're not stranded, he said finally. Elijah's ranch passes to you legally. You were his intended, and he named you in his will. The land, the house, the stock, it's yours. Lydia stared at him. That's impossible. We weren't married. I have no legal... Arizona territory law is different than back east. You had a contract with Elijah, documented in letters with clear intent to marry. A circuit judge was already scheduled to come through next month for the ceremony. As far as the law here is concerned, you're his rightful heir. Colt's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Congratulations, Miss Mercer. You're a landowner. The word should have brought relief, hope, something positive. Instead, Lydia felt the weight of them settle on her shoulders like a yoke. A ranch, land she'd never seen, stock she didn't know how to manage, in a territory where apparently men killed over water rights and got away with it. I don't know anything about ranching, she said weakly. No, but you can learn. Colt picked up her trunk again, moving toward the boarding house door. Mrs. Calloway will give you a room. I've already paid for 2 weeks. That should give you time to decide what you want to do. Sell the property, try to work it, head back east if you can scrape together the fare. You paid? Lydia followed him into the dim, blessedly cool interior of the boarding house. Why would you do that? Colt set down her trunk in the small parlor and turned to face her. In the filtered light through the lace curtains, his features seemed softer, younger, though no less intense. Because Elijah was my friend, he said simply. And because you came all this way in good faith, expecting a life that was stolen from you through no fault of your own. It seemed the least I could do. Mrs. Calloway appeared from the back room, a plump woman with kind eyes and silver hair pinned in a neat bun. She clucked sympathetically and ushered Lydia toward the stairs, promising tea and a cool bath and a bed that didn't move like a ship at sea. But at the foot of the stairs, Lydia turned back. Colt was heading for the door, his hat already back on his head, his shoulders set in a way that suggested he was eager to be gone. Mr. Ashford, she called. He stopped, half-turned, his profile sharp against the bright doorway. Thank you, Lydia said softly, for meeting me, for telling me the truth, even though it was terrible, for everything. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that granite facade. It's Colt, he said, and you don't need to thank me for common decency, Lydia. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Lydia standing in the dim parlor with her whole world turned upside down and the ghost of his voice still lingering in the air. Awesome. The bath was heaven, and the bed was softer than anything Lydia had slept on in months. But sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the small, neat room under the sloped ceiling, watching shadows from the single oil lamp dance across the whitewashed walls, and tried to make sense of the chaos her life had become. Elijah was dead. The man whose careful, respectful letters had promised her a home, a future, a place to belong, gone before she'd ever had the chance to meet him. She should be grieving, but how did one grieve a stranger? Instead, she felt numb, hollowed out, as though all the emotion had been scoured away by the desert sun. And then there was Colt Ashford, dangerous, intense Colt with his storm-gray eyes and his quiet competence. The way he'd looked at her on that platform, like she was a puzzle he needed to solve, or a treasure he'd stumbled across unexpectedly. It had made something in her chest tighten, something she had no business feeling about a man she'd just met while standing in the ruins of her carefully laid plans. A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Miss Mercer?" Mrs. Calloway's voice was muffled but kind. "I've brought you some supper. You must be famished." Lydia rose and opened the door to find the older woman holding a tray laden with roasted chicken, vegetables, fresh bread, and a pot of steaming tea. "You're too kind," Lydia said, stepping aside to let her enter. Mrs. Calloway set the tray on the small table by the window and turned to study Lydia with shrewd, not unkind eyes. "You've had a terrible shock, dear, but you're still among the living, and the living need to eat." "Yes, ma'am." Lydia sat obediently and picked up a fork, though her stomach felt like a clenched fist. Mrs. Calloway lingered by the door, clearly wanting to say something. Finally, she cleared her throat. "That Colt Ashford is a good man, whatever the town gossips might tell you." Lydia looked up sharply. "What do the gossips say?" "Oh, the usual nonsense, that he's too wild, too independent, that he broke some rich girl's heart back east and came here to escape his past." Mrs. Calloway waved a dismissive hand. "But I've known him 3 years, and I've never seen him be anything but honest and fair. He's helped more people in this town than anyone wants to admit." "He seems very capable," Lydia said carefully. Mrs. Calloway's eyes twinkled. "He's that and more, dear, but be careful. Colt Ashford is the kind of man who could break your heart without meaning to, simply because he's already decided his heart isn't available to be given." With that cryptic warning, she swept out of the room, leaving Lydia alone with her supper and a head full of new questions. Morning came too soon, announced by the raucous crowing of a rooster somewhere nearby, and the already climbing heat that seemed to seep through the very walls. Lydia dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a modest gray cotton with jet buttons, and pinned her auburn hair into a neat chignon. She studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back. 3 weeks of travel had left her thinner, her cheekbones more pronounced, her green eyes shadowed with exhaustion and uncertainty. But her chin was still lifted. Her spine was still straight. She was still standing. Downstairs, Mrs. Calloway had breakfast waiting. Eggs, bacon, grits, and strong coffee that made Lydia's eyes water. 2 other women sat at the long table, both eyeing Lydia with barely concealed curiosity. "Miss Mercer, this is Miss Sarah Winters and Mrs. Elizabeth Brennan," Mrs. Calloway said, making the introductions. "Ladies, this is Miss Lydia Mercer from Philadelphia." "The mail-order bride," Sarah said, not unkindly but with the bluntness of youth. She couldn't have been more than 19 with blonde ringlets and a pretty heart-shaped face. "We heard what happened. It's just terrible." "Sarah," Mrs. Brennan, older and more reserved, shot the girl a quelling look. "Mind your manners. It's all right," Lydia said, though it wasn't, not really. "Yes, I came to marry Elijah Ward, and yes, I arrived too late." "But you're staying." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "They're saying you inherited his ranch." "I don't know what I'm doing yet," Lydia admitted. She sipped her coffee, grateful for the bitter heat of it. "I need to see the property before I can make any decisions." "Colt Ashford can take you," Sarah said immediately. "He knows every inch of that land. He and Elijah were partners sometimes, helping each other during roundup and branding season." "Mrs." Brennan cleared her throat. "A young lady riding alone with a bachelor is hardly proper." "Nothing about my situation is proper," Lydia said with more sharpness than she intended. "I'm already the subject of town gossip, already labeled a mail-order bride, as though I'm no better than a piece of mail-order merchandise. My reputation can hardly be damaged further by accepting practical help from the man who was my intended's friend." Silence fell around the table. Then Mrs. Brennan's stern face softened into something almost like respect. "You've got spine, girl. You'll need it in this territory." After breakfast, Lydia sat in the small parlor and tried to compose a letter to the distant cousin who'd grudgingly housed her in Philadelphia before she'd left. But what could she say? "Dear Cousin Margaret, I arrived safely, but my groom is dead and I'm now an unlikely rancher in the Arizona territory." The absurdity of it made her want to laugh and cry in equal measure. A shadow fell across the open doorway, and Lydia looked up to find Colt Ashford standing there, hat in hand, looking somehow larger and more vital in the feminine space of Mrs. Calloway's parlor. "Miss Mercer," he said, his voice still carrying that rough gravel quality that seemed to resonate in her chest. I was thinking you might want to see the property today. Get a sense of what you're dealing with. Lydia set down her pen, grateful for the interruption. I'd like that, yes. Though I warn you, I know nothing about ranching. I taught school back in Philadelphia. My knowledge extends to literature, basic mathematics, and how to keep order in a classroom of unruly children. Something flickered in Colt's eyes. Amusement? Interest? That's more than most women out here can claim. And keeping order in a classroom probably isn't so different from managing stubborn livestock. Despite everything, Lydia found herself smiling. You've clearly never met 8-year-old Tommy Sullivan. Colt's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but close. I've got a buckboard outside. The ride out will take about an hour. Lydia gathered her bonnet and a shawl against the sun, ignoring Mrs. Brennan's disapproving sniff. She followed Colt outside into the already brutal morning heat and allowed him to hand her up onto the buckboard seat. His grip was firm, steadying, and he released her the moment she was settled, always proper, always respectful, but there was something in the way his hand lingered just a fraction longer than necessary that made her pulse quicken. They rode out of town in silence, the buckboard creaking and swaying over the rutted road. Apache Junction fell away behind them, and suddenly there was nothing but vast, empty desert stretching in every direction, red rocks and scrub brush and endless sky. It's so different from home, Lydia said softly, more to herself than to Colt. Philadelphia, he said. It wasn't a question. What was it like? Lydia considered. Crowded, loud, full of buildings and people and rules about what you could and couldn't do, who you could and couldn't be. She watched a hawk wheel overhead, its wings dark against the brilliant blue. I thought I'd miss it, but I don't think I do. This land gets under your skin, Colt said. It's harsh, unforgiving, but it's honest. Out here, you are exactly who you prove yourself to be through your actions. Nothing more, nothing less. No gossiping neighbors? Lydia asked with a trace of bitterness. Oh, there's always gossip, but it matters less. What matters is whether you can survive a drought, whether you'll help your neighbor when their barn burns, whether your word means something. He glanced at her, those gray eyes assessing. Elijah spoke highly of your letters, said you had grit and intelligence. That's worth more than gold out here. Warmth spread through Lydia's chest. Not attraction, she told herself firmly, but simple gratitude that someone saw value in her beyond her mistakes. He was kind in his letters, patient with my endless questions about life in the territory. He was a good man. Colt's voice went rough. Didn't deserve what happened to him. Tell me about Magnus Sloan. Colt's hands tightened on the reins, his knuckles going white. Sloan came to the territory 5 years ago with money from back east. Railroad money, mining money, no one's quite sure. He's been buying up land ever since, forcing out small ranchers and farmers. Anyone who won't sell, he trailed off meaningfully. Ends up dead, Lydia finished flatly. If you can prove it in a court of law, which so far nobody has. Frustration leaked through Colt's careful control. Sloan's smart. He hires men to do his dirty work, makes sure there are always witnesses to back his version of events. The territorial governor is in his pocket, and the sheriff... Colt shook his head. The sheriff does what he can, but he's one man against an empire. And now this empire wants my land. Yes. The single word hung heavy between them. Lydia absorbed it, turned it over in her mind, examined it from every angle. She should be terrified. A sensible woman would sell immediately, take whatever pittance Sloan offered, and run back east before ending up in a shallow grave next to Elijah. But Lydia hadn't been sensible when she'd answered Elijah's advertisement. She hadn't been sensible when she'd spent her last dollars on passage to a territory she'd never seen to marry a man she'd never met. And she discovered she didn't feel much like being sensible now. What if I don't sell? She asked quietly. Colt turned to look at her fully, and something blazed in those storm-gray eyes, surprise, respect, and something else she couldn't quite name. Then you're going to need help, good help, men who aren't afraid of Sloan and his hired guns. Men like you? Yes. Why? Lydia held his gaze, refusing to look away. Why would you risk yourself for a woman you barely know, for land that isn't yours? Colt was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost rough with emotion held carefully in check. Because Elijah was my friend and I owe him. Because what Sloan is doing is wrong, and someone needs to stand against it. And because... He stopped, seemed to wrestle with something, then continued. Because from the moment I saw you step off that stage yesterday, looking dusty and determined and scared but refusing to show it, I couldn't stop thinking that maybe some things are worth fighting for. Lydia's breath caught. The moment stretched between them, charged with something electric and dangerous. Then Colt turned back to the road, his jaw set, and Lydia forced herself to breathe again. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The ranch, when it finally appeared over a low rise, was modest but well-maintained, a small house with a covered porch, a barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed beside a creek that sparkled in the sunlight. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and Lydia felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Hope. Cooper's Creek, Colt said, pointing to the water. That's what Sloan wants. It's one of the few reliable water sources in the territory that isn't already under his control. Lydia stood in the buckboard, her hand shading her eyes, taking in every detail. Show me everything. They spent the next 2 hours walking the property. Colt explained the basics. The cattle needed to be moved to fresh grazing every few weeks. The fence lines needed constant maintenance. The house required repairs to the roof before the monsoon season started. The well was reliable but should be dug deeper as a precaution against drought. It was overwhelming. It was impossible. And yet, with every moment she spent on this land, Lydia felt herself taking root, the same way the scrub brush and mesquite trees had dug themselves into this unforgiving soil and survived. I want to try, she said finally, standing on the porch of what was now her house, looking out over her land. I want to make this work. Colt studied her face, his expression unreadable. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. Sloan won't give up. Then neither will I. The corner of Colt's mouth lifted in what might have been admiration. You really are something, Lydia Mercer. Before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. 3 riders were approaching at a canter, kicking up dust as they came. Colt's hand dropped instinctively to the gun at his hip, and Lydia felt her pulse spike with sudden fear. The riders reined in at the fence line. The man in the center was older, well-dressed in a tailored suit that seemed absurdly out of place in the desert heat. His face was fleshy and florid, his eyes cold and calculating beneath the brim of an expensive hat. Well, well, he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. The famous mail-order bride, Miss Mercer, I presume? And you are? Lydia asked, though she already knew. Magnus Sloan, at your service. He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. I wanted to come personally to offer my condolences on the loss of Mr. Ward. Tragic, truly tragic. Murder usually is, Colt said flatly. Sloan's eyes narrowed, but his smile never wavered. Now, Mr. Ashford, we've been through this. The territorial court ruled it a fair fight. But I understand emotions run high. He turned his attention back to Lydia. Miss Mercer, I also wanted to extend a business proposition. I know you find yourself in difficult circumstances, and I'd like to help. I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for this property. More than fair market value, I assure you. $5,000. It was more money than Lydia had ever seen. Enough to return east in comfort, start a new life, never have to worry about water rights or hired guns again. But she looked at Sloane's cold eyes, at the way his men sat their horses with hands resting casually near their guns, and she thought of Elijah Ward lying in the ground before she'd ever had a chance to meet him. No, she said clearly. Sloane's smile didn't waver, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. Miss Mercer, perhaps you don't fully understand the challenges of ranching in this territory. It's no life for a woman alone. There are difficulties. Dangers. Is that a threat, Mr. Sloan? Lydia stepped to the edge of the porch, her hands curled into fists in her skirts. Merely a statement of fact. Sloane's voice remained pleasant, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. I'd hate to see you meet the same unfortunate fate as Mr. Ward. Colt moved then, stepping between Lydia and the riders, his hand resting openly on his gun now. "You've made your offer and been refused. Time for you to leave." For a long moment, tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Then Sloane tipped his hat again, that false smile still fixed on his face. "Think about it, Miss Mercer. I'm a patient man, but my patience has limits. I'll be in touch." He wheeled his horse around, his men following, and they cantered away in another cloud of dust. Lydia realized she was shaking. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to still the tremors. "That," Colt said quietly, his eyes still tracking the riders until they disappeared over the rise, "is what you're up against." "I know." Lydia's voice was steadier than her hands, "but I meant what I said. I'm not selling." Colt turned to face her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Then we're going to need a plan. And you're going to need to learn to shoot." "Shoot?" Lydia's eyes widened. "Shoot," Colt confirmed. He moved past her into the house, and Lydia heard him rummaging around. He emerged a moment later with a gun belt and pistol. "This was Elijah's. It'll be big on you, but we can adjust it." He buckled the belt around her waist, his hands efficient but gentle, and Lydia was suddenly aware of how close he was, the warmth of him, the faint scent of leather and sage, and something uniquely him. His hands lingered on her waist for just a moment after the belt was fastened, and when she looked up, his face was inches from hers. "The most important thing," he said, his voice rough, "is to never point this at anything you don't intend to shoot. Understood?" Lydia nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. "Good." Colt stepped back, putting professional distance between them again. "Now, let's see if you can hit a target." They spent the rest of the afternoon in shooting practice. Lydia's hands shook at first, the weight and noise of the gun foreign and frightening. But gradually, under Colt's patient instruction, she began to find a rhythm. By the time the sun started its descent toward the western horizon, she'd managed to hit the tin can target 3 times out of 10. "Not bad for a first day," Colt said, and the approval in his voice warmed her more than it should have. They rode back to town in the golden light of late afternoon, both lost in their own thoughts. But as they approached Apache Junction, Colt spoke again. "There's something you should know about me." Lydia turned to look at him, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had tightened on the reins. "I came to the territory 3 years ago running from my past. I was engaged to a woman back east, Philadelphia, actually, Catherine Thornton. She was from a wealthy family, and I was a fool who thought love could bridge the gap between our worlds." He paused, and Lydia waited, sensing he needed to tell this in his own time. She ended it publicly at a society ball, announced to everyone that she'd only been toying with me, that she could never seriously consider marrying someone so far beneath her station. Her friends laughed. Her father had me thrown out. Colt's voice was carefully neutral, but Lydia could hear the old pain beneath it. "I left Philadelphia the next day and came west. I swore I'd never let anyone close enough to hurt me like that again." "Why are you telling me this?" Lydia asked softly. Colt pulled the buckboard to a stop just outside town, where the first buildings cast long shadows across the road. He turned to face her fully, and his eyes were raw with an emotion that made her heart pound. "Because I need you to understand that I'm not the man who can give you what you came west looking for. I can help you work your land, teach you what you need to survive, even stand between you and Sloane if it comes to that. But I can't—" He stopped, seemed to search for words. "I can't be who Elijah would have been for you. I don't have that in me anymore." Lydia looked at this complicated man with his storm-gray eyes and wounded heart, and she felt something shift in her chest, something dangerous and entirely unwise. "Maybe," she said quietly, "I didn't come west looking for Elijah. Maybe I came west looking for exactly what I found." Colt's breath caught audibly. For a moment, Lydia thought he might reach for her, might close the distance between them and kiss her the way his eyes suggested he wanted to. But then he released the brake and clicked to the horse, and they rolled into town in charged silence. He left her at Mrs. Calloway's door with nothing more than a tip of his hat and a promise to return in the morning to begin teaching her what she needed to know about running a ranch. But as Lydia climbed the stairs to her room, she caught a glimpse of him through the window, standing in the street, staring up at her window with an expression of such longing and conflict that it took her breath away. She'd come west to marry one man and found herself impossibly drawn to another. And as she lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this frontier town, Lydia realized that despite the danger, the impossibility of her situation, and the heartbreak that likely waited ahead, she'd never felt more alive. The desert had already begun to work its magic, stripping away everything false and leaving only what was real. And what was real was this. She was going to fight for this land. She was going to fight for her life here. And somewhere in that fighting, she was going to have to decide if she was brave enough to fight for the impossible possibility of Colt Ashford's guarded heart. Outside her window, the Arizona night settled over the territory like a blanket, full of stars and secrets and the promise of tomorrow's challenges. And Lydia Mercer, former teacher from Philadelphia, an unlikely rancher, closed her eyes and dreamed of storms. Dawn broke over Apache Junction with the same relentless heat that seemed to define everything in this territory. Lydia woke to the sound of roosters and the already oppressive warmth seeping through the thin walls of her room. She dressed quickly in her oldest dress, a faded calico that had seen better days, and braided her hair into a single plait down her back. If she was going to learn ranching, she needed to dress practically, not like a Philadelphia schoolteacher pretending to belong in the desert. Mrs. Calloway had coffee and biscuits waiting downstairs, along with a knowing look that made Lydia's cheeks warm. Colt Ashford was here before sunrise, the older woman said, pouring Lydia a cup of strong black coffee. Left word he'd be back at 7 to collect you. That man doesn't waste daylight. He's teaching me to run the ranch, Lydia said, perhaps more defensively than necessary. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Calloway's eyes twinkled. And a fine teacher he'll be, I'm sure. Before Lydia could respond, the sound of hoofbeats announced Colt's arrival. She grabbed her bonnet and the gun belt he'd given her yesterday. Already it felt less foreign strapped around her waist, and hurried outside. Colt sat astride his black stallion, leading a smaller mare by the reins. The mare was a pretty chestnut with a white blaze down her face and gentle eyes. Thought you'd need your own horse, Colt said by way of greeting. This is Copper. She belonged to Mrs. Harrison before she passed last winter. Good temperament, steady on rough ground. Lydia approached the mare cautiously, extending her hand for Copper to sniff. The horse nickered softly and nuzzled her palm. She's beautiful, Lydia breathed. But I can't possibly afford— She's yours, Colt interrupted. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. But you can't run a ranch without a horse, and Copper needs someone to ride her. It was charity dressed as practicality, and they both knew it. But Lydia was learning that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford in the Arizona territory. She stroked Copper's neck and nodded her acceptance. I should warn you, she said. I've only ridden a handful of times, and never alone. Something that might have been amusement flickered in Colt's eyes. Then today you learn. Come on, I'll help you up. His hand circled her waist, lifting her into the saddle with an ease that made her acutely aware of his strength. She settled herself, gripping the pommel perhaps harder than necessary, and tried to ignore the way her heart had stuttered at his touch. They rode out of town together, Colt setting a moderate pace that Copper matched easily. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, and despite her nervousness about the day ahead, Lydia felt something like peace settle over her. First thing you need to understand, Colt said as they rode, is that ranching out here is about survival, not profit, not comfort, survival. The land will kill you if you're not careful. So will the heat, the drought, the flash floods, the snakes, and men like Magnus Sloan. You paint such an appealing picture, Lydia said dryly. Colt's mouth twitched. I'm being honest. You deserve that much. But it's not all grim. There's a freedom here you won't find anywhere else. You work hard. The land provides. You prove yourself, and people respect you regardless of where you came from or who your family was. It's honest in a way nothing back east ever is. They arrived at the ranch as the sun climbed higher, already making the air shimmer with heat. Colt helped her down from Copper, his hands lingering on her waist just a fraction longer than necessary before he stepped back and became all business again. We'll start with the cattle, he said, leading both horses toward the barn. You've got about 30 head right now. Not a big operation, but enough to make a living if you manage them right. The morning passed in a blur of new information. Colt taught her how to read the brands on the cattle, how to spot signs of illness or injury, how to estimate the grazing capacity of different pastures. He showed her the fence lines that needed mending and explained the constant battle against erosion and flash floods that could wash away months of work in a single afternoon. Elijah was smart about water management, Colt said, crouching beside the creek that ran through the property. See how he diverted part of the flow here? Creates a backup reservoir for dry spells. That's why Sloan wants this land so badly. Elijah had the best water setup in the territory. Lydia knelt beside him, studying the careful system of channels and small dams. He must have worked so hard on this. He did. Took him 3 years to get it right. Colt's voice went rough, and Sloan destroyed it all in 3 minutes with a bullet. They were silent for a moment, the only sound the gentle burbling of the creek. Then Lydia stood, brushing dust from her skirts. Show me how to maintain it, she said firmly. If this is what Elijah died protecting, I'm going to make sure it wasn't for nothing. Colt looked up at her, something fierce and approving blazing in those storm-gray eyes. He stood slowly, never breaking eye contact. You've got spine, Lydia Mercer, more than most men I know. Or I'm just too stubborn to know when I'm beaten, she said, but warmth spread through her chest at his words. They worked through the midday heat, Colt showing her how to repair fence posts and string new wire. The work was hard, and Lydia's hands, soft from years of holding nothing heavier than chalk and books, quickly blistered despite the gloves Colt produced from his saddlebag. But she refused to complain, refused to show weakness, even when her back ached and sweat soaked through her dress. Around noon, they took shelter in the barn from the worst of the heat. Colt produced canteens of water and packages of jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag. It's not fancy, he said, handing her a portion. It's perfect, Lydia said, and meant it. She was too hungry to care about fancy. They ate in companionable silence, sitting in the cool dimness of the barn with dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced through gaps in the boards. Lydia found herself studying Colt when she thought he wasn't looking. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he removed his hat, the capable hands that could gentle a horse one moment and handle a gun the next. You're staring, Colt said without looking at her, a hint of amusement in his voice. Lydia felt her cheeks flame. I was just thinking. About how strange this all is. A week ago, I was in Philadelphia preparing to marry a man I'd never met. Now I'm sitting in a barn in the Arizona territory with a completely different man I've known less than 2 days, and somehow this feels more real than anything in my entire life before this moment. Colt did look at her then, his expression unreadable. Real isn't always comfortable. No, Lydia agreed, but it's honest. Like you said, this place strips away everything false. And what's left? Colt asked, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. Once everything false is stripped away, what's left of Lydia Mercer? Lydia considered the question seriously. Someone stronger than I knew. Someone who's tired of being told what she can and cannot do. Someone who's ready to fight for something that's hers. Even if it costs you everything? I left Philadelphia with nothing, Lydia said. Everything I have now, this land, this chance, it's already more than I had before. So yes, even if it costs everything. Colt was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as though trying to read the truth written there. Then he stood abruptly, the moment breaking like a snapped thread. Come on, he said, extending his hand to help her up. Still plenty of daylight left, and you need to learn how to work the cattle. The afternoon was even hotter than the morning, if that was possible. Colt taught her how to move cattle from one pasture to another, how to separate calves from their mothers for counting, how to spot signs of predators, both the four-legged and two-legged varieties. Lydia's initial fear of the large animals gradually gave way to respect as she learned their patterns and personalities. They're smarter than they look, Colt said, watching her successfully guide a stubborn heifer back toward the herd. And they remember people. Treat them right, they'll trust you. Treat them wrong, they'll make your life hell. Rather like people, Lydia observed. Exactly like people. Only more honest about it. They were heading back toward the barn when the sound of multiple horses made them both freeze. Colt's hand dropped to his gun, his body going tense as a drawn bowstring. Get behind me, he said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. But Lydia could already see the riders cresting the rise, 5 men this time, riding hard and fast toward the ranch house. Magnus Sloane wasn't among them, but she recognized 2 of the men from yesterday. The one in the lead was tall and lean, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. He wore his guns low on his hips with the practiced ease of someone who used them often. The riders reined in at the fence line, their horses snorting and stamping. The lean man smiled, showing too many teeth. "Well now," he drawled, his eyes moving over Lydia in a way that made her skin crawl. "This must be the famous Miss Mercer. Pretty little thing, aren't you? Shame about your intended." "State your business," Colt said flatly, his hand still resting on his gun. "Oh, we're just being neighborly," the man said. "Name's Jake Reeves. I work for Mr. Sloane. He sent us out to check on Miss Mercer, make sure she's settling in all right. These can be dangerous parts for a woman alone." "She's not alone," Colt said. Reeves' eyes flickered with something ugly. "That's right. You've been spending an awful lot of time out here, haven't you, Ashford? People are starting to talk. Widow woman and a bachelor, all alone on a remote ranch. Not very proper, is it?" Lydia stepped forward before Colt could respond, anger overriding her fear. "I'm not a widow, Mr. Reeves, as I was never married. And what I do on my own property is my concern, not yours, and certainly not Magnus Sloane's." Reeves's smile widened. "Spirited. I like that. But you should be careful, Miss Mercer. Accidents happen out here. Fences break, cattle stray, houses catch fire. Would be a real shame if something happened to this pretty little place." "That sounds like a threat," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the fear climbing her spine. "Just stating facts, ma'am. The territory's a dangerous place. Mr. Sloane's offer still stands, $5,000, and you can walk away before something unfortunate happens." "The answer is still no." Reeves' expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Lydia said, "but it's mine to make." For a long, tense moment, Reeves stared at her. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of respect. "Have it your way. But don't say we didn't warn you." He wheeled his horse around, his men following, and they thundered away in a cloud of dust. Lydia realized she was shaking again. Colt's hand closed gently on her shoulder, steadying her. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said quietly. "Probably both." Lydia turned to face him. "But I meant what I said. I'm not selling." "Then we need to talk about protection, real protection." Colt's expression was grim. "Sloane just sent his top enforcer to intimidate you. Next time it won't be just words and veiled threats." "What do you suggest?" "We hire help. Good men who aren't afraid of Sloane and can handle themselves in a fight." Colt began walking toward the barn, Lydia following. "I know a few who might be willing, but it'll cost money, and from what I saw of Elijah's books, the ranch is barely breaking even." Lydia's stomach sank. She'd been so focused on learning the land that she hadn't considered the financial realities. "How much money?" "Hard to say. Depends on how many men we need and for how long, but probably more than you have." They reached the barn, and Colt pulled out a battered ledger from a trunk in the tack room. He spread it open on a workbench, showing Lydia columns of numbers in Elijah's careful handwriting. "He kept good records," Colt said, pointing to various entries. "Income from cattle sales, expenses for feed and supplies, property taxes. He was making it work, but there wasn't much margin for error, or for hiring armed guards." Lydia studied the numbers, her teacher's training making the arithmetic easy to follow, even if the ranching terminology was unfamiliar. Colt was right. Elijah had been managing, but just barely. There was no reserve for emergencies, let alone for the small army they apparently needed. "I could sell some of the cattle," she said slowly. "Not enough time, and you'd get pennies on the dollar with Sloane controlling the buyers." Colt rubbed his jaw, thinking. There might be another way. The Territorial Bank in Tucson sometimes extends loans to ranchers with good water rights. I could ride there, make the case. "No." Lydia closed the ledger with finality. "I won't put myself in debt before I've even started. There has to be another way." "Lydia, you're going to need help. Then I'll hire one man, the best one. But I'm not mortgaging my future to Magnus Sloane's bank before I've even had a chance to prove I can do this." Colt studied her face, frustration and admiration warring in his expression. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't meant as one. I'm taking it anyway. Despite everything, Colt's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Fine, one man. I know someone who might be interested, Tom Winters. He's Sarah's older brother, worked for Elijah last year during Roundup. Good with cattle, steady in a crisis, and he's no coward. Will he work for a woman? He'll work for anyone who pays fair and treats him with respect, which, if you haven't noticed, is exactly how you operate. Warmth spread through Lydia's chest again, that dangerous warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat and everything to do with the way Colt looked at her. She forced herself to focus on practical matters. How much would he cost? $30 a month plus room and board. You'd need to fix up the bunkhouse. It's in rough shape, but nothing that can't be managed with some work. Lydia did the calculations in her head. $30 a month was steep but manageable if she was careful. And having another person on the property would mean she wouldn't be alone, wouldn't be completely dependent on Colt's help, which was becoming dangerously important to her. All right, she decided. Talk to him. See if he's interested. I will. Colt closed the trunk and straightened. But in the meantime, you're not staying out here alone. Not after today. I have to eventually, not until we have Tom or someone else in place. You'll stay at Mrs. Calloway's and I'll ride out each day to tend the stock and keep an eye on things. Lydia wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could manage alone, but the memory of Jake Reeves' cold eyes and cruel smile stopped her. She wasn't foolish enough to think she could defend this place by herself. Not yet. All right, she agreed reluctantly, but only until Tom's in place. They rode back to town as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took Lydia's breath away. The desert might be harsh, but it was also beautiful in a way that Philadelphia had never been, raw and real and impossibly vast. Tell me about Catherine, Lydia said suddenly as they rode. Colt stiffened in his saddle. Why? Because you told me about her to warn me away, but now I want to understand. Who was she? What happened? For a long moment, Colt said nothing, and Lydia thought he might refuse to answer. Then he sighed, the sound carrying years of old pain. Catherine Thornton was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, cultured, from a family with old money and older connections. I met her at a horse auction. I was working as a horse trainer back then, building a reputation. She was there with her father, and she smiled at me, and I was lost. He paused, his hands tightening on the reins. We courted for 6 months. She seemed to enjoy slumming with the rough horse trainer, and I was fool enough to think she actually cared. When I proposed, she said yes. Her father went cold, but Catherine insisted she loved me, that we'd make it work. But you didn't, Lydia said softly. She invited me to a ball at her family's estate. I showed up in my best suit, which wasn't nearly good enough, as it turned out. And Catherine was there in a dress that cost more than I made in a year, on the arm of Harrison Whitmore, son of a railroad magnate. She looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. Colt's voice had gone flat, emotionless, but Lydia could hear the hurt underneath. She announced to the entire room that our engagement had been a joke, a diversion to pass the time, that she'd never seriously consider marrying someone so far beneath her station. Her friends laughed. Harrison laughed. And I stood there like a fool while her father had his men throw me out. That's horrible, Lydia breathed. That's society, Colt corrected. I learned a valuable lesson that night. Love isn't real. It's just people using each other until they find someone better. So I came west, and I decided I'd never let anyone close enough to teach me that lesson again. They had reached the edge of town, and Colt pulled his horse to a stop. He turned to face Lydia, his expression carefully guarded. That's why I told you yesterday that I can't give you what Elijah would have. I don't have that kind of trust left in me. I can be your friend, your teacher, your protector if you need one, but I can't be more than that. Lydia looked at this proud, wounded man, and her heart ached for him. But she also heard the warning in his words, the carefully erected walls designed to keep everyone at a safe distance. What if I don't want more? She asked quietly. What if friendship is enough? Something flickered in Colt's eyes. Relief? Disappointment? Both? Then we understand each other. But as they rode the final distance into town, Lydia knew she was lying. Friendship wasn't enough, wouldn't be enough, even though it should be. She'd known Colt Ashford less than 3 days, and already he'd worked his way under her skin in a way that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Mrs. Calloway had supper waiting, a hearty stew and fresh bread that Lydia devoured despite her exhaustion. Sarah Winters appeared halfway through the meal, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Mercer, I heard Jake Reeves came out to your place today. Are you all right?" News traveled fast in Apache Junction. Lydia set down her spoon and nodded. "I'm fine. Mr. Ashford was with me." "Well, thank goodness for that." Sarah sat down uninvited, clearly eager for details. "Jake Reeves is the meanest man in the territory. They say he's killed at least 5 men. "Sarah!" Mrs. Calloway's voice was sharp. "Mind your manners and stop gossiping." "It's not gossip if it's true," Sarah protested, but she subsided under Mrs. Calloway's stern look. Lydia excused herself and climbed the stairs to her room, every muscle in her body protesting. She washed the day's dust away with water from the pitcher and changed into her nightgown, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too full of cattle and fences and water rights, of Jake Reeves' threats and Magnus Sloane's cold ambition, and most of all, of Colt Ashford and the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. A soft knock at her door made her start. She grabbed her shawl and opened it to find Sarah standing there, her expression unusually serious. "May I come in?" Sarah asked. Lydia stepped aside, and Sarah slipped into the room, closing the door behind her. "I wanted to talk to you about Colt," Sarah said without preamble. "Mrs. Calloway would scold me for interfering, but I think you should know the whole story." Lydia's heart clenched. "He told me about Catherine." "Did he tell you about the duel?" "What duel?" Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her face grave. After Catherine humiliated him, Colt challenged Harrison Whitmore to a duel. It was illegal, of course, but men of a certain class still observed the practice. They met at dawn in a private park. Harrison shot first and missed, deliberately, I think. He wasn't trying to kill Colt, just satisfy honor. And Colt? Colt shot the gun out of Harrison's hand. Didn't kill him, didn't even wound him seriously. Just showed him that he could have, if he'd wanted to. Then he left Philadelphia and never looked back. Sarah leaned forward. "The point is, Miss Mercer, Colt Ashford is a man who keeps his word and protects what matters to him. But he's also a man who's been hurt badly, and he won't risk that kind of hurt again easily." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah smiled, a knowing expression that made her look older than her years. "Because I've seen the way you look at each other. And I've watched Colt spend more time at your ranch in 3 days than he spent with anyone in 3 years. He's fighting something, and I think you are too. I just wanted you to know what you're up against if you decide to fight for him." After Sarah left, Lydia lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind whirling. She'd come west to escape her past and start fresh, not to fall for a damaged cowboy with a guarded heart. But the heart, she was discovering, didn't much care about sensible plans. The next morning brought Tom Winters to Mrs. Calloway's door, a tall, quiet man in his mid-20s with Sarah's blonde hair and serious blue eyes. He held his hat in his hands and spoke with careful respect. "Mr. Ashford said you might be looking for help at the Ward Ranch, Miss Mercer. I'm interested in the position if it's still available." Lydia invited him to sit, and they talked for an hour about ranching, about his experience, about what she needed and what he could offer. Tom was straightforward and competent, and by the end of their conversation, Lydia knew she'd found her man. $30 a month plus room and board, she said. "The bunkhouse needs work, but Mr. Ashford says it's manageable." "I can fix it up myself," Tom said. "When do you want me to start?" "As soon as possible. Today, if you can manage it." Tom's mouth curved in a slight smile. "Eager to get out to your property, Miss Mercer?" "Eager to stop being run off my own land by men like Magnus Sloane," Lydia corrected. Tom's expression turned serious. "I should tell you up front. Working for you might make me a target too. Sloane doesn't like people who stand against him." "I know, and I wouldn't blame you if you walked away." "I'm not walking away?" Tom stood, extending his hand. "My sister says you've got spine, and from what Colt tells me, she's right. I don't mind working for a woman with spine, especially one who's willing to stand up to the likes of Magnus Sloane." Lydia shook his hand, relief and gratitude washing through her. She wasn't alone anymore. She had help, had allies. had a fighting chance. That afternoon, Colt, Tom, and Lydia rode out to the ranch together. The men set to work immediately on the bunkhouse while Lydia handled the cattle, applying everything Colt had taught her the day before. It was hard work, and she made mistakes, but each small success built her confidence. As the sun began its descent, painting the ranch in golden light, Lydia stood on her porch and looked out over her land. Tom was in the bunkhouse, hammering away at repairs. Colt was by the creek, checking the water channels. And Lydia felt for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach like she might actually belong here. Colt joined her on the porch, wiping sweat from his brow with his bandana. "Tom's a good man," he said. "You made the right choice." "Thanks to you," Lydia said. "You would have figured it out on your own eventually. You're smart, and you learn fast." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the shadows lengthen across the desert. Then Colt spoke again, his voice lower, more intimate. "I've been thinking about what I said yesterday, about not being able to give you more than friendship." Lydia's heart began to pound, but she kept her voice steady. And I might have been wrong, or not wrong exactly, but..." He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. "I don't know how to do this, Lydia. I don't know how to trust again, how to let someone in, but I also can't seem to stay away from you, and that terrifies me more than anything Magnus Sloane could throw at us." Lydia's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Then maybe we figure it out together. Maybe we don't need to have all the answers right now." Colt looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face. "You make it sound simple. Maybe it is. Maybe we're the ones making it complicated. Or maybe..." Colt began, but the sound of approaching horses cut him off. They both turned to see riders in the distance, silhouetted against the setting sun. Not Sloane's men this time. These riders carried themselves differently, moved with purpose rather than menace. As they drew closer, Lydia could make out the gleam of badges on their chests. The sheriff of Apache Junction, a weathered man in his 50s named Jack Cooper, reined in at the porch along with 2 deputies. His expression was grave. "Evening, Colt. Miss Mercer." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'm afraid I've got some news you won't like." "What kind of news?" Colt asked, his body going tense. "Magnus Sloane filed a formal complaint with the territorial court. He's claiming that Elijah Ward's will is fraudulent, that Miss Mercer has no legal right to this property, and that the land should revert to the territory for auction, which means Sloane can buy it legally." Lydia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "That's ridiculous. I have Elijah's letters, documentation of our intent to marry. I know, Miss Mercer, and I believe you. But Sloane's got lawyers, expensive ones from back east, and they're claiming the will was forged after Elijah's death. They're demanding a formal investigation and a court hearing." "When?" Colt's voice was hard as stone. 3 weeks. The circuit judge will be through then, and he'll hear both sides." Sheriff Cooper's expression was sympathetic but resigned. "Until then, I have to ask you not to make any major changes to the property or sell any assets. Everything needs to stay exactly as it is for the court to evaluate." "So I'm trapped," Lydia said flatly. "Can't sell even if I wanted to, can't make improvements, can't do anything but wait while Sloane's lawyers try to steal my land legally. I'm sorry, Miss Mercer. I know it's not fair, but it's the law." After the sheriff left, Lydia sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Colt sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "He's not going to win," Colt said quietly. "You don't know that." "I know you, and I know you're not going to let some corrupt lawyer steal what's yours." Lydia turned to look at him, this complicated man who'd somehow become essential to her in less than a week. "Why do you believe in me so much?" Colt reached up, his callous thumb brushing gently across her cheek. "Because from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, you've been fighting. Against impossible odds, against a harsh land, against men who want to break you, and you haven't broken. That kind of strength, it's rare, Lydia, and it's worth believing in." The sun had set completely now, leaving them in the soft purple twilight that seemed to make everything feel more intimate, more possible. Lydia felt herself leaning closer, drawn by some magnetic force she couldn't resist. Colt's breath hitched, his eyes dropping to her lips, and for one perfect, suspended moment, she thought he might kiss her. But then Tom called from the bunkhouse, asking about something, and the spell broke. Colt stood quickly, putting distance between them, his walls slamming back into place. "We should head back to town," he said, his voice rough. "It's getting dark." The ride back was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But when they reached Mrs. Calloway's, Colt caught Lydia's hand before she could dismount. 3 weeks, he said. "We've got 3 weeks to find proof that Elijah's will is legitimate and that Sloane's claim is fraudulent. I know a lawyer in Tucson who might be able to help, and there has to be someone who can testify to Elijah's intent, someone who knew about you and the plan to marry." "You're not giving up," Lydia said. "Neither are you." She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. "No, I'm not." That night, as Lydia lay in bed reviewing everything that had happened, she realized that somewhere in the chaos of learning to ranch and fighting Magnus Sloane and navigating her growing feelings for Colt Ashford, she'd stopped being the frightened woman who'd arrived 3 days ago. She'd become someone new, someone stronger, fiercer, more certain of herself than she'd ever been in Philadelphia. The desert was stripping away the false Lydia Mercer and revealing someone she was only beginning to know. And that someone wasn't going to let Magnus Sloane or corrupt lawyers or even her own fears stop her from claiming the life she'd come west to find. The fight was just beginning, but Lydia Mercer was ready for it. The following days blurred into a relentless rhythm of work and worry. Lydia threw herself into learning everything she could about the ranch, as though mastering the land itself might somehow strengthen her legal claim to it. Tom proved invaluable, patient with her endless questions, and quick to step in when her inexperience showed. But it was Colt who remained her constant, arriving before dawn each morning, staying until the last light faded, teaching her not just the mechanics of ranching, but the soul of it. "You've got to read the land," he told her one morning as they rode the fence line, checking for breaks. "See how the grass grows thicker near that outcropping? Means there's water underground. And those tracks there, coyote, probably scouting the herd. You need to know this place like you know your own heartbeat." Lydia absorbed it all, her teacher's mind cataloging every detail, every lesson. But beneath the education, tension simmered. They were running out of time, and everyone knew it. A week after the sheriff's visit, Colt returned from Tucson with a lawyer named James Morrison, a thin, scholarly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of quiet competence. They gathered in Lydia's small ranch house, spreading documents across the kitchen table while Tom kept watch outside. "The situation is complicated," Morrison said, reviewing Elijah's will and the letters between him and Lydia. "Arizona territory law does recognize intent to marry as a form of contract, particularly in frontier circumstances where formal marriages are often delayed by distance or lack of clergy. Your correspondence is clear, detailed, and spans several months. That works in your favor." "But," Lydia prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice, "but Magnus Sloane has hired Theodore Blackwell, one of the most ruthless lawyers in the Southwest. Blackwell's argument will be that these letters were forged after Elijah's death, that you had no legitimate relationship with him, and that you're attempting to steal property through fraud." Morrison looked at her over his spectacles. "He'll try to destroy your character, Miss Mercer. He'll dig into your past, find anything that can be twisted against you." Lydia's stomach clenched. Her past wasn't scandalous, but it wasn't pristine either. The boarding house in the questionable neighborhood, the lost teaching position, the desperation that had driven her to answer a mail-order bride advertisement, all of it could be weaponized in the wrong hands. "Let him dig," she said, lifting her chin. "I have nothing to hide." Colt's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. The touch was brief, probably invisible to Morrison, but it steadied her. "We need witnesses," Morrison continued. "Anyone who can testify that Elijah spoke of his plans to marry you, that he showed them your letters, that he was making preparations for your arrival. The more people who can corroborate your story, the stronger our case." "I can testify," Colt said immediately. "Elijah talked about Lydia constantly, showed me her letters, asked my advice about fixing up the house for her. Everyone in town knew he was expecting a bride." "Good. We'll need others as well. The storekeeper if Elijah purchased anything for the house, the reverend if he discussed wedding plans, anyone and everyone." They spent the next 3 hours strategizing, with Morrison making notes in his precise handwriting. By the time he left, Lydia's head was spinning with legal terminology and courtroom procedures, but she felt marginally more prepared for the battle ahead. Colt lingered after Morrison rode out, helping Lydia clean up the scattered papers. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting everything in warm gold. "You're quiet," Colt observed. "Just thinking about what Morrison said, about Blackwell digging into my past?" Lydia stacked the documents carefully, not meeting his eyes. "There are things about me you don't know, Colt. Things that might not reflect well in a courtroom." "Like what?" Lydia hesitated, then decided he deserved the truth. "Like the fact that I lost my teaching position because the school board deemed my living situation inappropriate. My boarding house was in a neighborhood known for certain kinds of establishments. I couldn't afford anywhere else after my parents died, but the school board didn't care about reasons. They only cared about appearances." "That's why you answered Elijah's advertisement," Colt said slowly. "You were desperate." "Yes." The admission hurt, but also liberated. I had no family, no prospects, nowhere to go. Elijah's offer was the only option I had left. So if Blackwell wants to paint me as an opportunist who came west to trap a naive rancher, he'll have plenty of ammunition. Colt was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he crossed to her, taking both her hands in his. "Listen to me," he said, his voice intense. "You did what you had to do to survive. There's no shame in that. And anyone who tries to use your courage against you is going to have to go through me first." Lydia looked up into those storm-gray eyes and felt something in her chest crack open. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you're honest and brave and stronger than you think you are. I know you've worked harder in 2 weeks than most people work in a year. And I know—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw clenching as though holding back words that wanted to escape. "You know what?" Lydia whispered. But before Colt could answer, the sound of multiple horses approaching made them both freeze. Through the window, Lydia could see riders, at least a dozen of them, riding hard toward the ranch house. At their head was Magnus Sloan himself, his expensive suit somehow still immaculate despite the dust. "Stay inside," Colt ordered, his hand dropping to his gun. "This is my ranch. I'm not hiding." They stepped out onto the porch together as the riders reined in. Sloan dismounted with practiced ease, his cold eyes moving between Lydia and Colt with calculation. "Miss Mercer," he said pleasantly, as though they were meeting at a social function, "I thought it was time we had a proper conversation." "We have nothing to discuss," Lydia said flatly. "Oh, I think we do." Sloan moved closer, his men fanning out behind him in a clear show of force. "You see, I've been doing some research into your background. Fascinating reading, really. A school teacher dismissed for moral impropriety, desperate enough to become a mail-order bride. One might wonder what other lengths you'd go to for financial security." "Careful, Sloan," Colt warned, his voice dangerous. Sloan ignored him, his attention fixed on Lydia. "I'm prepared to be generous, Miss Mercer. Drop this fraudulent claim to Ward's property, leave the territory quietly, and I'll give you $1,000, enough to start fresh somewhere else. Refuse, and I'll destroy you in court. By the time Theodore Blackwell is finished with you, you won't be able to show your face anywhere in the Southwest." Lydia felt rage building in her chest, hot and fierce. She stepped forward, ignoring Colt's restraining hand on her arm. "You can threaten me all you want, Mr. Sloan. You can drag my name through the mud, paint me as whatever villain suits your purposes. But this land is mine, legally and morally, and I will fight you in court with every resource I have. Now get off my property." Something ugly flickered across Sloan's face. "Your property? We'll see about that." "The hearing is in less than 2 weeks, Miss Mercer. I hope you're prepared for what's coming." "Are you?" Lydia shot back. "Because I'm prepared to tell the court exactly what happened to Elijah Ward, how he refused to sell, and 3 days later he was conveniently shot in what you claim was a fair fight. How every witness worked for you. How Jake Reeves threatened me just days after I arrived. The pattern of intimidation and violence is clear, Mr. Sloan. Maybe the court should be investigating you." The temperature seemed to drop despite the desert heat. Sloan's men shifted uneasily, hands drifting toward their guns. Jake Reeves, sitting his horse at Sloan's right, smiled his cruel smile. "That sounds an awful lot like an accusation," Reeves said softly. "Could be considered slander." "Only if it's false," Lydia said, meeting his cold gaze without flinching. Colt moved then, positioning himself between Lydia and the mounted men, his hand resting openly on his gun. "Time for you to leave, Sloane. Now." For a long, tense moment, violence hung in the air like a drawn breath. Then Sloane laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Very well. We'll continue this conversation in court." He remounted his horse with fluid grace. "But understand this, Miss Mercer. I always get what I want. Always. The only question is how much it costs everyone else." They rode away in a thunder of hooves, leaving Lydia shaking with delayed reaction. Colt's hands closed on her shoulders, turning her to face him. "That was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless," he said, his voice rough with emotion she couldn't quite name. "You said those exact words before." "Because you keep doing incredibly brave, incredibly reckless things." His hands tightened on her shoulders. "Lydia, you can't provoke Sloane like that. He's dangerous." "I know he's dangerous, but I won't be intimidated on my own land." She looked up at him, her chin lifted stubbornly. "Would you have done any differently?" Colt's mouth twitched despite the gravity of the situation. "No, which is why I understand exactly how infuriating you are." "I'm infuriating?" Lydia felt a laugh bubble up despite everything. "You're the most stubborn, overprotective man I've ever met. Someone has to protect you from yourself." "I don't need protection. I need—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "What?" Colt asked, his voice dropping to something more intimate. "What do you need?" "You," Lydia wanted to say. "I need you. And that terrifies me because I've known you less than 2 weeks, and I shouldn't feel this way, shouldn't want this much, shouldn't be willing to risk everything for something that might not even be real." But before she could find the courage to speak, Tom appeared from the barn, his face grave. "Colt, we've got a problem. Some of the cattle are missing. At least 10 head that I counted this morning aren't in the north pasture." The moment shattered. Colt released Lydia and strode toward Tom, his expression going hard. Could they have wandered? "Not through the fence. It's been cut. Clean cuts with wire snips, not broken." Tom's jaw clenched. "Someone rustled them, and recently." Lydia felt cold despite the heat. "Sloane?" "Most likely," Colt said grimly. "Probably while he was here talking to us, his men were helping themselves to your herd. It's a message. He can take from you any time he wants, and there's nothing you can do about it." "Can we track them?" Lydia asked. "Find proof it was Sloane's men?" "We can try, but by now they're probably already mixed in with Sloane's herd, and good luck getting the sheriff to search his property without solid evidence." Colt rubbed his jaw, thinking, "We need to post watches, make sure no one can hit us again without warning. Tom, you take first shift tonight. I'll spell you at midnight." "I can help," Lydia said. "No." Colt's voice was firm. "You need to focus on preparing for court. Let us handle security." Lydia wanted to argue, but she recognized the wisdom in his words. She was learning the ranch, but Tom and Colt were the ones with experience, with the skills needed to defend it. Trying to do everything herself would only make things worse. That night, as Lydia lay in her bed in the small ranch house, she'd moved out to the property full-time once Tom arrived, she could hear the soft sounds of the men changing watch. Through her window, she could see Colt's silhouette against the starlit sky, rifle cradled in his arms, standing guard over her land and her dreams. The next week passed in a blur of preparation and paranoia. Morrison returned twice more to rehearse testimony, drilling Lydia on what to say and how to say it. The Reverend agreed to testify that Elijah had discussed marriage plans. The storekeeper confirmed Elijah had purchased new furniture and household goods in the weeks before Lydia's arrival. Slowly, they built their case. But Sloane didn't remain idle. 3 more times, Lydia's cattle went missing. Never large numbers, but enough to be noticed, enough to drain resources and spread fear. The fence was cut again. The water channels were sabotaged, requiring a full day of repairs. And always, when they went looking for evidence, they found nothing concrete enough to take to the sheriff. "He's wearing you down," Morrison said during one of his visits, "trying to make you too exhausted and demoralized to fight effectively in court. It's an old tactic, but effective." "Then we don't let him see it's working," Lydia said firmly, though in truth she was exhausted. The constant vigilance, the physical labor, the emotional strain of the upcoming hearing, It was all taking its toll. The town's annual barn dance fell 3 days before the court hearing, and Mrs. Calloway insisted Lydia attend. "You need to be seen by the community," the older woman said firmly. "Need them to see you as a real person, not just the mail-order bride everyone gossips about. Public opinion matters, even in court." Lydia didn't want to go, didn't want to face the whispers and stares, didn't want to waste time on frivolity when she had so much to prepare. But Sarah showed up with one of her own dresses, a pretty blue cotton with white trim, and wouldn't take no for an answer. "You're going," Sarah said firmly, helping Lydia into the dress, "and you're going to hold your head high and show everyone that you belong here." The dance was held in the largest barn in Apache Junction, decorated with lanterns and bunting. Music from a fiddle and guitar filled the air, and it seemed like the entire town had turned out. Lydia arrived with Sarah and Mrs. Calloway, intensely aware of the eyes that followed her, the whispers that rippled through the crowd. But Tom was there, offering his arm with quiet solidarity. And then Colt appeared, cutting through the crowd like a force of nature, and Lydia's breath caught. He'd cleaned up for the occasion, fresh clothes, his dark hair combed back, his jaw freshly shaved. But it was the look in his eyes as he approached her that made her heart stutter. "Miss Mercer," he said formally, though his eyes were anything but formal. "May I have this dance?" Lydia placed her hand in his, and suddenly they were moving onto the dance floor, his hand at her waist, their bodies falling into rhythm with an ease that should have been impossible for two people who'd never danced together before. "You look beautiful," Colt said quietly, for her ears alone. "You don't look so bad yourself," Lydia managed, though her pulse was racing. They danced in silence for a moment, the world narrowing to just the two of them despite the crowd around them. Then Colt spoke again, his voice rough with emotion. "Lydia, after the hearing, after this is all settled, I need to tell you something I should have told you weeks ago." "Tell me now," Lydia said. "I can't. Not here, not like this, but soon." His hand tightened on her waist. "Just promise me you'll still be here to listen." "I'm not going anywhere," Lydia said firmly. The music swelled and they turned across the floor, lost in each other. For those few minutes, the troubles fell away. No Sloan, no court hearing, no threats or sabotage. Just two people finding something unexpected in the harsh desert, something that felt remarkably like hope. But the moment couldn't last. The music ended, and as Colt escorted Lydia from the floor, Jake Reeves stepped into their path. "Well, well," Reeves drawled, his eyes moving over Lydia in a way that made her skin crawl. "The mail-order bride cleans up real nice. Tell me, Miss Mercer, how much did you offer Ashford here to pretend to care about you? Or is he getting paid in other ways?" Colt moved so fast Lydia barely saw it. One moment Reeves was smirking, the next he was on the ground with Colt standing over him, fists clenched. "Get up," Colt said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get up and apologize to the lady, or I'll drag you outside and teach you some manners the hard way." Reeves wiped blood from his split lip, his eyes ugly with rage. "You're going to regret that, Ashford. The only thing I regret is not doing it sooner. Now apologize." The barn had gone silent, everyone watching. Reeves slowly got to his feet, his hand drifting toward his gun. "Don't," Sheriff Cooper said sharply, appearing from the crowd. "Don't even think about it, Jake. Not in my town." Reeves glared at Colt, at Lydia, at the sheriff. Then he spat blood on the floor and stalked out of the barn, his men following. The silence stretched for another beat. Then the music started up again, people determinedly returning to their celebrations as though nothing had happened. But Lydia saw the looks, heard the whispers. This would be all over town by morning, another piece of gossip, another mark against her reputation. Colt's hand found hers, solid and warm. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have lost my temper." "Don't apologize for defending my honor," Lydia said quietly. "Even if my honor isn't worth much in this town." "Your honor is worth everything," Colt's voice was fierce. "Don't ever let anyone tell you different." They left the dance early, riding back to the ranch in silence. But as they neared the property, Lydia saw something that made her blood run cold. Orange light flickered against the night sky. Fire. The barn! Colt spurred his horse forward, Lydia right behind him. They arrived to chaos. The barn was fully engulfed, flames shooting into the sky. Tom was there with buckets from the well, but it was clearly hopeless. The fire was too big, too hot, spreading too fast. "Anyone inside?" Colt shouted over the roar of the flames. "No, I got the horses out first thing," Tom called back. "But the hay, the equipment, it's all gone." They fought the fire for hours, trying to keep it from spreading to the other buildings. By the time it finally burned itself out, exhausted and covered in soot, they stood staring at the smoking ruins of what had been Elijah's carefully built barn. "Reeves," Colt said flatly. "Has to be. He left the dance, came straight here." "Can we prove it?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. "No, he'll have an alibi, probably a dozen witnesses saying he was nowhere near here." Tom kicked at the charred remains of a support beam. "This is bad, Miss Mercer, real bad. Without the barn, winter's going to be hell. And rebuilding will cost more than you've got." Lydia stood looking at the ruins of her barn, her clothes filthy, her hands blistered from fighting the fire, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and rage. This was what Magnus Sloan did to people who opposed him, destroyed them piece by piece until they had nothing left to fight with. But as she stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, something crystallized inside her, a resolution hard as diamond and just as unyielding. "Then we rebuild," she said quietly. "After the hearing, after we've secured the property legally, we rebuild. And we keep going, because that's what Sloan doesn't understand. You can burn down a barn, you can steal cattle, you can sabotage water lines, but you can't break someone who refuses to be broken." Colt moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and grounding. "You're sure? Because there's still time to walk away, Lydia. Take Sloan's money and start over somewhere else. No one would blame you." "I would blame me." Lydia turned to face him, this man who'd somehow become essential to her survival, to her hope, to her heart. "I came west to find a place to belong, Colt, and I belong here, on this land, in this fight with—" She stopped, the words catching. "With who?" Colt asked, stepping closer. "With you," Lydia whispered. "God help me. I belong with you, and I know it's too soon and too complicated and probably too impossible, but it's true anyway." Colt's breath caught. For one perfect, suspended moment, he just stared at her, his eyes blazing with emotion in the firelight. Then his hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing gently across her cheekbone, leaving a streak of clean skin through the soot. "Lydia," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I told myself I wouldn't do this. Told myself I couldn't risk it, couldn't trust it. But from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach looking dusty and determined and terrified but too stubborn to show it, I was lost. I've been fighting it for weeks, but I can't fight it anymore." "Then don't," Lydia said simply. Colt's other hand found her waist, pulling her closer. "If I kiss you now, everything changes. No going back, no pretending this is just friendship or practical partnership. It becomes real." "It's already real," Lydia said. "It's been real since the beginning. We've just been too scared to admit it." "I'm still scared," Colt admitted. "Scared of losing you, scared of failing you, scared of—" Lydia rose on her toes and kissed him, cutting off his words. For a heartbeat, Colt froze in surprise. Then his arms came around her, crushing her against him, and he was kissing her back with a fierce intensity that stole her breath and made the world spin. The kiss tasted of smoke and desperation and hope. It was everything Lydia had been denying herself, everything she'd been too scared to want. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said quietly. "I've loved you from the moment you stepped off that coach, maybe even before that. And it terrifies me. But it's true." Tears pricked Lydia's eyes, tears of exhaustion and joy and relief all mixed together. "I love you too, even though it's insane and we barely know each other and the timing couldn't be worse." "The timing is perfect," Colt interrupted. "Because if we're going into battle against Sloan, I want you to know exactly where I stand. I'm not just fighting for your ranch, Lydia. I'm fighting for our future, for the life we could build together if we're brave enough to try." The first fingers of dawn were painting the sky pink and gold, illuminating the ruins of the barn and the two people standing in its shadow, holding each other as though they could hold back the world itself through sheer force of will. Tom cleared his throat discreetly from somewhere behind them. "Sorry to interrupt, but we should probably get the horses settled and catch a few hours of sleep before we need to deal with the sheriff's investigation." The fire will bring him out, and we need to be ready to answer questions. Reality crashed back in, harsh and unforgiving. Lydia stepped out of Colt's embrace, though their hands remained linked. Tom's right, she said. We need to be practical. Being practical doesn't mean we stop feeling, Colt said, squeezing her hand. It just means we're smart about how we fight. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of activity. The sheriff came, investigated, and confirmed what they already knew. The fire had been deliberately set, but there was no evidence pointing to anyone specific. Lydia filed a formal complaint anyway, adding it to the growing list of incidents she was documenting for court. Morrison arrived the day before the hearing, looking grave. I need to prepare you for what's coming tomorrow, he said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. Blackwell is going to attack your character viciously. He'll paint you as an opportunistic woman who came west to trap a naive rancher, who may have even had something to do with Elijah's death in order to inherit his property faster. That's insane, Lydia protested. It's effective. He'll point out that you arrived just days after Elijah's death, that you immediately claimed his property, that you've been suspiciously quick to establish yourself here. He'll question why Elijah never mentioned you to anyone except Colt. Because he was a private man who didn't gossip about his personal life, Lydia interrupted. We know that, but Blackwell will suggest it's because you didn't exist in his life until after he died, that the letters were forged, the relationship fabricated. Morrison looked at her seriously. You need to be prepared to have your entire history dissected. He'll ask about Philadelphia, about why you lost your teaching position, about the men in your boarding house, about anything and everything that can be twisted to make you look disreputable. Lydia felt her stomach clench, but she lifted her chin. Let him try. I have nothing to hide. Good, because tomorrow you're going to need every ounce of that strength. That night, Lydia couldn't sleep. She stood on her porch, looking out over the land she'd come to love, and tried to prepare herself for the battle ahead. Colt found her there, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, he said, handing her one. They stood in silence for a while, sipping the bitter brew and watching the stars. Finally, Colt spoke. No matter what happens tomorrow, you need to know something. I meant what I said the other night. I love you, and I'm not going anywhere. If Sloan wins, if the court rules against you, we'll figure something out. Find other land, start over. But we do it together. Lydia turned to face him, her heart full. I don't deserve you. That's where you're wrong. Colt set down his cup and pulled her into his arms. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to give it to you. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And standing there in the darkness with this man who'd somehow become her whole world, Lydia felt something she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. She felt hope. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the Arizona sun already beating down mercilessly as they prepared to ride into town for the hearing. Lydia dressed in her best remaining dress, pinned her hair in a severe bun, and tried to look like a respectable woman rather than a desperate fortune hunter. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. It seemed like the entire territory had turned out to watch the spectacle of Magnus Sloan versus the mail-order bride. Lydia walked in with her head high, Colt at her right side and Morrison at her left, refusing to show the fear that churned in her stomach. Magnus Sloan sat at the opposite table with Theodore Blackwell, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who radiated predatory confidence. When Blackwell looked at Lydia, she saw nothing but cold calculation in his eyes. The judge, a weathered man named Hutchins with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, called the court to order, and the battle for Lydia's future began. Blackwell rose from his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a case he cared about winning. His expensive suit was immaculate despite the desert heat, his silver hair gleaming in the light that streamed through the courthouse windows. When he smiled at the judge, it was the smile of a shark scenting blood in the water. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. This case is remarkably straightforward, despite my colleagues' attempts to complicate it. We have before us a woman who arrived in Apache Junction mere days after Elijah Ward's tragic death, claiming to be his intended bride based on correspondence that cannot be verified. She immediately took possession of valuable property, settled herself in his home, and now refuses all reasonable offers to purchase said property at fair market value. Morrison started to rise, but Judge Hutchins waved him back down. "I'll hear the full opening statement, Mr. Morrison. You'll get your turn." Blackwell nodded his thanks and continued, beginning to pace before the judge's bench like an actor on a stage. "The question before this court is simple. Did Elijah Ward truly intend to marry Miss Mercer, or is she a clever opportunist who saw a chance to acquire valuable land through fraudulent claims? My client, Mr. Sloan, has reason to believe the latter. He knew Elijah Ward personally, conducted business with him, and never once heard mention of a bride coming from the East." "That's a lie," Colt said quietly, but not quietly enough. The judge's sharp eyes swung toward him. "Mr. Ashford, you'll have your chance to testify. Until then, keep your comments to yourself or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." Colt's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Lydia found his hand under the table, squeezing it tightly. She could feel the rage radiating off him in waves, but they both knew he had to control it. Losing his temper now would only play into Blackwell's hands. "Furthermore," Blackwell continued, "we must consider Miss Mercer's history. A woman who lost her teaching position under questionable circumstances, who lived in a boarding house in a disreputable neighborhood, who was desperate enough to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride. These are not the actions of a respectable woman, Your Honor. These are the actions of someone who would do anything, say anything, to escape poverty and gain financial security." The words hit Lydia like physical blows. She kept her face carefully neutral, but inside she felt her past being twisted into something ugly and damning. Morrison had warned her this would happen, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of the entire town was worse than she'd imagined. "We will demonstrate," Blackwell said, his voice rising with theatrical intensity, "that Miss Mercer had never met Elijah Ward, had no legitimate relationship with him, and fabricated this entire tale after learning of his death and the valuable property he left behind. We will show that her so-called evidence, letters that could easily have been written by anyone, is fraudulent, and that her claim to Ward's ranch is nothing more than an elaborate theft." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, then turned to look directly at Lydia. "And we will prove that Miss Lydia Mercer is exactly what she appears to be. A desperate woman willing to lie, cheat, and steal to escape the consequences of her own poor choices." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Hutchins banged his gavel, calling for order, but Lydia barely heard it over the roaring in her ears. She felt exposed, flayed open, every mistake and misfortune of her life put on display for public judgment. Morrison stood slowly, his scholarly face calm but his eyes sharp behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Your Honor, that was quite a performance from my colleague. Lots of dramatic accusations, but short on actual facts. Mr. Blackwell would have this court believe that Miss Mercer is some sort of criminal mastermind who orchestrated an elaborate fraud. Let me offer a simpler explanation. She's exactly who she claims to be, a respectable woman who entered into a legitimate agreement with Elijah Ward to become his wife." Morrison moved to stand beside Lydia, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Yes, Miss Mercer lost her teaching position in Philadelphia, not because of any moral failing on her part, but because the school board objected to her living situation after her parents' deaths left her impoverished. Yes, she answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride, because that was a respected and common practice for building families and communities in frontier territories. And yes, she arrived shortly after Elijah Ward's death, not because she planned it that way, but because Magnus Sloan murdered Ward before Miss Mercer could complete her journey. Now it was Blackwell's turn to object. Your Honor, that's a serious accusation. That I can back up with a pattern of evidence, Morrison interrupted smoothly, but we'll get to that. For now, I simply want to establish the facts. Miss Mercer has multiple letters from Elijah Ward spanning several months, detailing their correspondence and plans to marry. She has witnesses who will testify that Ward spoke of these plans openly. She has documentation of her journey west, timed to arrive for a wedding that would have taken place had Ward not been killed. These are facts, Your Honor. Not accusations, not insinuations, facts. Morrison returned to his table and picked up a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. And these letters, which Mr. Blackwell dismisses as potentially fraudulent, contain details about Ward's life, his ranch, his hopes for the future that no stranger could have known. They reference specific events, specific conversations that can be corroborated by witnesses. If Miss Mercer forged these, she would have needed access to intimate knowledge of Ward's life, knowledge she could not have possessed before arriving in Apache Junction. Judge Hutchins leaned forward, his sharp eyes studying Morrison. You'll be presenting these letters as evidence? Yes, Your Honor, along with testimony from multiple witnesses including Mr. Colt Ashford, Reverend Thomas, and Marcus Green from the general store, all of whom can confirm Ward's intentions and preparations for marriage. Very well. Mr. Blackwell, call your first witness. Blackwell smiled his shark smile. I call Magnus Sloane to the stand. Sloane took the witness box with the bearing of a man who owned the room. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore his oath, and settled into the chair as though it were a throne. Mr. Sloane, Blackwell began, how long did you know Elijah Ward? About 4 years. I arrived in the territory about a year after he did. We weren't close friends, but we did business together from time to time. And in those 4 years, did Mr. Ward ever mention plans to marry? Ever speak of a woman in Philadelphia? Never. Not once. Sloane's voice was confident, certain. Elijah was a private man, I'll grant you, but we talked about the future, about building the territory. If he'd had a bride coming, he would have mentioned it. Men out here always do. It's a significant event. And yet Miss Mercer claims she and Ward had been corresponding for months, planning a life together. Does that align with the man you knew? No. Elijah was cautious, practical. He wouldn't have committed to marriage with a woman he'd never met, no matter what some advertisement promised. Sloane shook his head sadly, playing the part of the concerned citizen perfectly. I hate to say it, but I believe Miss Mercer took advantage of a tragic situation. Elijah dies, she shows up claiming to be his bride, and suddenly she owns valuable property. It's too convenient. Morrison stood. Your Honor, Mr. Sloane is speculating, not providing factual testimony. Sustained. Mr. Sloane, stick to what you know, not what you believe. Blackwell nodded smoothly. Of course, Your Honor. Mr. Sloane, let's talk about the property itself. You made an offer to purchase Ward's ranch, is that correct? Yes, after his death. I knew the land would pass to someone, and I wanted to expand my holdings. I offered Miss Mercer $5,000, well above market value, because I understood her difficult position. And she refused? Multiple times. Even after I explained the challenges of running a ranch alone, even after incidents of theft and vandalism made it clear the property was becoming a liability, she refused every reasonable offer. Why do you think that is? Morrison objected again. Speculation, Your Honor. I'll rephrase, Blackwell said. Mr. Sloane, in your business experience, why might someone refuse a generous offer for property they're struggling to maintain? Because they believe it's worth more than it actually is, or because they're holding out for an even higher price? Or, Sloane paused dramatically, because they acquired it fraudulently, and selling it would require documentation they can't provide. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Hutchins banged his gavel, but the damage was done. Sloane had planted the seed of doubt expertly. Morrison's cross-examination was brief and focused. Mr. Sloane, you say Ward never mentioned marriage plans, but you also said you weren't close friends. Isn't it possible he simply didn't discuss personal matters with you? Possible, but unlikely. You made multiple offers to purchase Ward's property before his death, correct? Sloane's eyes narrowed slightly. I made one offer, which he refused. Just one? Morrison pulled out a document. I have testimony from 3 witnesses who heard you pressure Ward repeatedly to sell. Is that testimony inaccurate? I may have mentioned it more than once in casual conversation, and when he refused, your men shot him in what you claim was self-defense. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Objection. Blackwell was on his feet. Your Honor, Mr. Ward's death was investigated and ruled a fair fight by territorial authorities. Mr. Morrison is attempting to retry a settled matter. Sustained. Mr. Morrison, focus on the matter at hand. Of course, Your Honor. Morrison smiled thinly. No further questions for this witness. Blackwell called several more witnesses, townspeople who claimed they'd never heard Ward mention a bride, ranch hands who testified that Ward seemed content with his bachelor life. Each one chipped away at Lydia's story, making her feel smaller and less substantial with every passing minute. Then Blackwell called his most damaging witness, Mrs. Prudence Hartford, a stern-faced woman who had served on the school board in Philadelphia. Mrs. Hartford, you were involved in the decision to terminate Miss Mercer's employment. Is that correct? Yes. Mrs. Hartford's voice was cold, disapproving. The board felt she was not a suitable moral influence on young children. Can you elaborate on why? She was living in a boarding house in a neighborhood known for prostitution and gambling establishments. Several board members expressed concern that her living situation reflected poorly on her judgment and character. When we investigated further, we discovered she associated with several unmarried men at her boarding house, often without proper chaperonage. Lydia's hands clenched into fists under the table. Every word was technically true, but stripped of context, it sounded sordid and damning. Yes, there had been unmarried men at the boarding house, clerks and laborers who could afford nothing better, just like her. Yes, they'd sometimes shared meals in the common room because that's what poor people did to survive. But Mrs. Hartford made it sound like a brothel. And was Miss Mercer's teaching performance adequate? Blackwell asked. Her teaching was satisfactory, but character matters, Mr. Blackwell. We couldn't have a woman of questionable morals influencing impressionable young minds. Morrison's cross-examination was more aggressive. Mrs. Hartford, when you investigated Miss Mercer's living situation, did you also investigate why she was living there? Her reasons were her own concern. Did you know her parents had died, leaving her penniless? That she was an orphan with no family support? I was aware of her circumstances, yes. And did you offer any assistance? Help her find more suitable lodging? Provide any support at all? Mrs. Hartford's expression hardened. That was not the board's responsibility. So you fired a young woman who'd just lost her parents, who was struggling to survive on a teacher's meager salary because she couldn't afford to live in a neighborhood you approved of? We fired her because her situation was inappropriate. You fired her because you valued appearances over compassion. No further questions. Mrs. Hartford stepped down, but the damage lingered. Lydia could see it in the faces of the townspeople, the doubt, the judgment, the willingness to believe the worst. The morning stretched into afternoon. Blackwell called more witnesses, each one painting Lydia as opportunistic at best, criminal at worst. By the time Judge Hutchins called for a lunch recess, Lydia felt battered and bruised, as though she'd been physically beaten. Colt found her outside the courthouse, standing in the shade and trying to breathe through the pain of having her entire life dissected and distorted. Don't listen to them, he said fiercely, pulling her into his arms despite the watching crowd. None of that changes who you are or what's true. It doesn't have to be true, Lydia said bitterly. It just has to sound convincing, and Blackwell is very convincing. So is Morrison. And he hasn't even started presenting our case yet. Colt tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. This isn't over, Lydia. Not by a long shot. The afternoon session began with Morrison calling his witnesses. First came Reverend Thomas, a gentleman in his 60s who testified that Elijah had spoken to him multiple times about marriage plans, that he'd asked about scheduling a wedding ceremony for late summer. He was excited, Reverend Thomas said, his voice warm with memory, more animated than I'd seen him in years. He showed me a photograph of Miss Mercer, spoke about her teaching background, said he felt blessed to have found such a woman. Did he show you any letters from her? Morrison asked. Yes, 2 of them. He was proud of her intelligence, her articulation. He read me passages about her hopes for starting a school in Apache Junction, about teaching the ranch children. Blackwell's cross-examination tried to shake the Reverend's testimony, suggesting Ward might have been fooled by fraudulent letters, but Reverend Thomas held firm. I've counseled many couples in my time, Mr. Blackwell. I know the difference between a man genuinely in love and a man being deceived. Elijah Ward was genuine. Next came Marcus Green from the general store, who testified about Elijah purchasing household goods, curtains, dishes, a new mattress in the weeks before Lydia's arrival. He told me he was fixing up the place for his bride, Marcus said. Showed me her letters, asked my advice on what a lady might need. He was nervous, excited. It was real. I'd stake my reputation on it. One by one, Morrison built his case. Tom Winters testified about finding Elijah's journal entries mentioning Lydia and the wedding plans. Sarah Winters testified that her brother had told her all about the expected bride weeks before Lydia's arrival. The stagecoach driver confirmed he'd carried letters from Apache Junction to Philadelphia and back multiple times over the preceding months. Then Morrison called Colt to the stand. Colt took the oath and sat down, his storm-gray eyes finding Lydia's across the courtroom. For a moment it felt like they were alone, like no one else existed. "Mr. Ashford," Morrison began, "how long did you know Elijah Ward?" 3 years. We worked together during roundups, helped each other with fence repairs and cattle drives. He was my closest friend in the territory. Did he discuss personal matters with you? Yes. We talked about everything, ranching, the future, our pasts. Elijah knew about my history in Philadelphia, and I knew about his hopes for building a family. Did he mention plans to marry? Constantly, for months leading up to Miss Mercer's arrival. He showed me her letters, read passages aloud, asked my opinion about everything from what furniture to buy to whether he should plant a garden for her. He was deeply in love with her before she ever left Philadelphia. Morrison handed Colt several letters. Do you recognize these? Yes, these are Elijah's. I recognize his handwriting. He showed me drafts sometimes, asked if something sounded right or if he should word it differently. He wanted everything to be perfect for her. In your opinion, Mr. Ashford, was Elijah Ward's intention to marry Miss Mercer genuine? Absolutely, without question. He spoke of nothing else for months. And when he was killed, Colt's voice roughened with emotion, he had her photograph in his pocket. He carried it everywhere. The courtroom went silent. Morrison produced the photograph, worn at the edges from handling, stained with what might have been blood. This photograph was found on Elijah Ward's body, Morrison said quietly. On the back, in his handwriting, it says, My Lydia, soon. He passed it to Judge Hutchins, who studied it carefully before setting it aside with visible solemnity. Blackwell's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to suggest Colt was lying to help Lydia, that they'd concocted this entire story together, that perhaps they'd even been involved before Elijah's death. But Colt remained calm, his answers steady and unshakable. Mr. Ashford, isn't it true that you've been spending considerable time with Miss Mercer, living on her property, helping her run the ranch? Yes. And isn't it also true that you have romantic feelings for her? Colt didn't hesitate. Yes. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Lydia felt her cheeks flame, but Colt's eyes never left hers. So you have a personal interest in her retaining this property, Blackwell said triumphantly. Your testimony is hardly unbiased. My feelings for Miss Mercer developed after she arrived, Colt said firmly, after I'd already spent weeks helping Elijah prepare for her. My testimony about Elijah's intentions is based on months of friendship and conversation with him, not on my current relationship with her. And yes, I care about her. Any man with eyes and half a brain would. But that doesn't change what Elijah felt, what he planned, or what he wanted. Blackwell tried several more angles of attack, but Colt held firm. When he finally stepped down, Lydia felt tears burning behind her eyes. He'd admitted his feelings for her in front of the entire town, had made himself vulnerable in a way she knew cost him dearly. The final witness of the day was Lydia herself. Morrison had prepared her extensively, but nothing could truly prepare her for the exposure of standing in that witness box. Every eye in the courtroom fixed on her, judging her, weighing her worth. Morrison's questioning was gentle, walking her through her history with compassion, giving her space to explain the context behind every decision Blackwell had twisted. She spoke about losing her parents, about the loneliness and desperation of being alone in Philadelphia, about answering Elijah's advertisement with hope and trepidation. I didn't come west looking for easy money or to steal anyone's property, she said clearly. I came because Elijah Ward offered me something I'd never had, a home, a partner, a future. His letters were kind and honest and real. I fell in love with the man in those letters before I ever left Philadelphia. And how did you feel when you arrived to learn he'd been killed? Morrison asked softly. Devastated, lost. Like I'd traveled 3 weeks to discover the future I'd been dreaming about had been stolen before I could even reach for it. Lydia's voice cracked, but she pushed on. But then I saw the land Elijah loved, the home he'd built, the dreams he'd had, and I knew I couldn't just walk away. This place, it's the future we were supposed to build together. And maybe I can't have him, but I can have this. I can honor what he wanted by fighting for it. Morrison nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. But now came the moment Lydia had been dreading. Blackwell approached the witness box like a predator circling wounded prey. Miss Mercer, you say you loved Elijah Ward, but you never met him, did you? Not in person, no. Never spoke to him? Never saw him except in a single photograph? Yes. And yet you claim to have loved him. Isn't that convenient? Isn't it easy to love a dead man who can't contradict your version of events? I love the man I came to know through his letters, Lydia said steadily. The man who wrote about his hopes and fears, who shared his dreams for the future, who treated me with respect and kindness. That man was real to me, whether you believe it or not. Those letters, you say they're genuine, but can you prove Elijah Ward actually wrote them? Do you have any witnesses who saw him writing to you? Colt Ashford testified. Mr. Ashford, who admits to having romantic feelings for you. A biased witness, at best. Blackwell leaned against the witness box, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. Let me offer another scenario, Miss Mercer. You're in Philadelphia, desperate, poor, hearing stories about the wealthy ranchers out west. You do some research, learn about Elijah Ward and his valuable property. You write letters to yourself, forge his name, create a paper trail, then you wait for opportunity. That's not what happened, Lydia said, but her voice wavered. No? Then explain this. How did you know exactly when to arrive in Apache Junction? The timing was remarkably precise. Ward dies on a Tuesday, and you arrive the following Friday. Almost as if you knew he'd be dead. I didn't know. I was traveling for 3 weeks, following the schedule we'd agreed on, a schedule you claim you agreed on. But what if you were actually tracking him, waiting for news of his death before making your dramatic entrance? Morrison objected. Your Honor, Mr. Blackwell is speculating wildly. I'm establishing a pattern of suspicious behavior, Blackwell countered. Your Honor, I moved to submit telegraph records showing that someone in Philadelphia inquired about Elijah Ward's status 2 weeks before Miss Mercer began her journey west. The courtroom erupted. Lydia felt the ground shift beneath her. She had made inquiries. She'd sent a telegram to the territorial office asking if her mail to Apache Junction was being received, if there was any problem with delivery since Elijah's letters had stopped coming for 2 weeks. It had been innocent, just concerned that her correspondence was getting through. But in Blackwell's hands, that innocent inquiry became evidence of sinister planning. Your Honor, Morrison said urgently, I need to see these records. You'll have your chance to review them before tomorrow's session, Judge Hutchins said. This court is adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The gavel fell, and Lydia felt what little hope she'd been clinging to shatter like glass. Outside the courthouse, Morrison pulled her and Colt aside, his expression grave. Those telegraph records are a problem. Not insurmountable, but a problem. We need to find the actual telegrams, see exactly what she asked and when. If we can show it was innocent concern and not suspicious investigation. I'll ride to Tucson tonight, Colt said immediately. The Territorial Telegraph Office will have copies. It's a full day's ride there and back, Morrison warned. You won't make it before morning. Then I'll ride through the night. Court doesn't start until 9. I can be back by 8 if I push hard. Colt looked at Lydia, his eyes fierce. I'm not letting them twist something innocent into proof of guilt. Lydia grabbed his arm. It's too dangerous. The roads at night are less dangerous than losing this case. Colt pulled her aside, away from Morrison's hearing. Lydia, listen to me. I'm not letting you lose everything because Blackwell is good at making innocent actions look guilty. I'll get those telegrams and I'll be back in time. Trust me. I do trust you. I'm just afraid. Colt kissed her, quick and fierce, in full view of anyone who cared to look. Don't be afraid. Be ready to fight. Because tomorrow, we're going to show that courtroom exactly who you are, a woman who came west looking for a home and is brave enough to fight for it. He rode out within the hour, pushing his black stallion into the gathering darkness. Lydia watched him go with her heart in her throat, terrified and grateful in equal measure. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in her room at Mrs. Calloway's, reviewing her own copies of the letters from Elijah, trying to prepare for whatever Blackwell would throw at her tomorrow. But her mind kept drifting to Colt, riding through the night, risking himself for her future. Sarah slipped into her room sometime after midnight carrying tea and sympathy. "He'll make it back," Sarah said firmly, as though she could make it true through sheer force of will. "Colt Ashford is the most stubborn, capable man in the territory. If anyone can ride to Tucson and back in one night, it's him." "What if Sloane's men are watching the roads?" Lydia whispered. "What if they—" "Then they'll regret it. Colt's not easy to ambush, and everyone knows it." Sarah squeezed Lydia's hand. "You need to rest. Tomorrow's going to be hard, and you need to be strong." But rest wouldn't come. Lydia lay in bed watching the window, waiting for dawn, praying that Colt would return safely, that the telegrams would prove her innocence, that somehow they'd find a way through this nightmare. Dawn broke gray and uncertain, unusual for the Arizona desert. Lydia dressed carefully, her hands shaking as she fastened the buttons on her dress. She arrived at the courthouse at 8:30, Morrison by her side, both of them scanning the street for any sign of Colt. 8:45. The courtroom began to fill. 8:50. Still no Colt. "We may have to proceed without him," Morrison said quietly. "The judge won't delay for a witness who doesn't appear." "He'll be here," Lydia said, though her voice shook with uncertainty. 8:55. The courtroom was packed, Blackwell and Sloane at their table looking smug and confident. Judge Hutchins entered, took a seat, opened his mouth to call the court to order, and the courtroom doors burst open. Colt strode in, covered in dust, his clothes filthy, his face exhausted but triumphant. He carried a leather satchel which he handed directly to Morrison. "Telegraph records from the Tucson office," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Every inquiry made about Elijah Ward in the 6 months before his death, including Miss Mercer's, all properly documented and dated." Judge Hutchins banged his gavel as the courtroom erupted. "Mr. Ashford, you're out of order." "My apologies, Your Honor." Colt didn't look apologetic at all. He looked fierce and defiant and utterly magnificent. "But Mr. Morrison requested these documents, and I rode through the night to retrieve them. I believe they're relevant to today's proceedings." Morrison was already pulling documents from the satchel, his eyes scanning quickly. Then he smiled, a genuine smile of relief and vindication. "Your Honor," he said, "I request permission to enter these telegraph records as evidence. They show that Miss Mercer made exactly one inquiry about Elijah Ward before her journey west. A routine question about mail delivery sent 2 weeks before she left Philadelphia, when Ward's letters had temporarily stopped coming. The inquiry was innocent, exactly as she claimed, and completely consistent with her story of being his intended bride concerned about correspondence." Blackwell rose. "Your Honor, I haven't had time to review—" "Neither had we when you sprung these records on us yesterday," Morrison countered smoothly, "but I'm happy to give you time to examine them. I believe you'll find they completely exonerate my client of any suspicious behavior." Judge Hutchins took the documents, studied them for several long minutes while the courtroom held its collective breath. Finally, he set them down and looked at Blackwell with something that might have been disapproval. "Mr. Blackwell, these records appear to show exactly what Mr. Morrison claims. Unless you have evidence to the contrary, I'm inclined to dismiss your insinuation that Miss Mercer was tracking Mr. Ward's status for nefarious purposes." Blackwell's confident smile had slipped. "Your Honor, I'd like to review the complete records." "You may do so, but unless you find something substantive, we're moving on. Mr. Morrison, do you have any further witnesses?" "Yes, Your Honor. I call Colt Ashford back to the stand." Colt took the witness box again, looking like he might collapse from exhaustion at any moment, but holding himself upright through sheer determination. "Mr. Ashford," Morrison began, "you rode through the night to Tucson and back to retrieve these records. Why?" "Because I knew Miss Mercer was innocent, and I knew Blackwell was twisting innocent actions to make them look guilty. I wasn't going to let that happen." "That's quite a commitment to someone you've known only a few weeks." "It's quite a commitment to the truth," Colt said firmly, "and to a woman who's been nothing but honest and brave since the moment she arrived in this territory. She deserves better than to have her character assassinated by men who care more about profit than justice." Morrison paused, letting Colt's words sink in. Then he asked the question that would make or break everything. "Mr. Ashford, you testified yesterday that you have romantic feelings for Miss Mercer. Given that, how can this court trust your testimony?" Because my feelings don't change the facts, Colt said, his eyes finding Lydia's. Elijah Ward loved her. He planned to marry her. He died before that could happen. Those are facts, regardless of how I feel. But yes, I love her. I love her courage, her honesty, her refusal to be broken by men like Magnus Sloan, and I'll spend the rest of my life fighting for her if that's what it takes, because she's worth fighting for. The courtroom was silent. Even Judge Hutchins seemed moved by the raw honesty in Colt's voice. Morrison nodded slowly. No further questions, Your Honor. Blackwell's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Colt was too exhausted to be baited, too certain of the truth to be shaken. When he finally stepped down, he moved to sit directly behind Lydia, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder in silent support. Judge Hutchins called for closing arguments. Blackwell went first, still trying to paint Lydia as an opportunist, but his earlier confidence had evaporated. The telegraph records had undermined his conspiracy theory, and without that his case rested on little more than insinuation and character assassination. Then Morrison stood for his closing argument. Your Honor, this case is about a woman who dared to hope for a better life. Lydia Mercer answered an advertisement from a man she'd never met because she had courage enough to believe in the possibility of building something real, even across 3,000 miles of distance. She and Elijah Ward spent months getting to know each other through correspondence, building a foundation for marriage that was as legitimate as any courtship conducted in person. Morrison held up the bundle of letters. These letters are real. The handwriting has been verified as Elijah Ward's. The content contains intimate knowledge of his life, his property, his hopes for the future. The witnesses have testified that Ward spoke openly of his marriage plans, made preparations, carried Miss Mercer's photograph in his pocket until the day he died. He set the letters down and faced Judge Hutchins directly. The only evidence to the contrary comes from Magnus Sloan, a man who had both motive and opportunity to kill Elijah Ward, who is engaged in a systematic campaign of intimidation and violence against Miss Mercer, who stands to profit enormously if she loses this property. His testimony is not credible. His lawyer's insinuations are not evidence. And this court should not reward his tactics by giving him what he couldn't take through honest means. Morrison's voice rose with passion. Lydia Mercer is who she claims to be, Elijah Ward's intended bride, the legal heir to his property, and a woman brave enough to fight for what's rightfully hers. I ask this court to recognize her claim, honor Ward's intentions, and send a message that justice in this territory cannot be bought by the highest bidder. Judge Hutchins called for a brief recess to consider his decision. The wait was agony. Lydia sat with her hands clenched in her lap, Colt's solid presence behind her the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Judge Hutchins returned. The courtroom fell silent as he took his seat and looked out over the assembled crowd. I've considered all the evidence presented, he began, and I'm prepared to render my judgment. Lydia's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The court finds that Lydia Mercer's claim to Elijah Ward's property is legitimate and legally sound. The correspondence between Ward and Miss Mercer establishes clear intent to marry, verified by multiple witnesses and supported by Ward's own documented preparations. The suggestion that this correspondence was forged or fraudulent is not supported by credible evidence. Lydia felt tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't tell if they were tears of relief or disbelief. Furthermore, Judge Hutchins continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, I note with concern the pattern of intimidation and violence against Miss Mercer since her arrival. While this court has no jurisdiction over those matters, I'm referring the evidence presented to the territorial marshal for investigation. Mr. Sloan, consider yourself warned. Any further incidents will be met with the full force of territorial law. Sloan's face had gone red with barely controlled rage. Miss Mercer, the property is yours. This court recognizes your claim and dismisses Mr. Sloan's challenge with prejudice. Case closed. The gavel fell with finality. For a moment, Lydia couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what had just happened. Then Colt was pulling her to her feet, his arms around her, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. You did it, he said fiercely. You won. We won, Lydia corrected, pulling back to look at him. I couldn't have done this without you. You could have, Colt said, but I'm damn glad you didn't have to. Around them, the courtroom was emptying. Some people congratulated her, others left with disapproving looks. Sloane stormed out without a word, Blackwell and Jake Reeves following. But Lydia barely noticed. She was too busy holding on to Colt, this man who'd ridden through the night for her, who'd fought for her when she had nothing to offer in return except hope and trust. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now?" Colt smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Now we go home, to your ranch, and we start building the life you came west to find." Home. The word resonated through Lydia's chest like a bell. She had a home. She had land. She had a future. And she had Colt Ashford, who'd loved her before she'd even known his name, who'd seen her worth when the rest of the world saw only a desperate mail-order bride. They walked out of the courthouse together into the brilliant Arizona sunshine, and for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach weeks ago, Lydia felt like she truly belonged. The ride back to the ranch felt different than any journey Lydia had made before. The desert landscape that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving when she'd first arrived now looked almost welcoming, the red rocks glowing in the afternoon sun like they were celebrating alongside her. Colt rode beside her, exhausted but refusing to rest until they reached home, and Tom had ridden ahead to spread the news of their victory. "You need to sleep," Lydia said, studying Colt's face with concern. He looked ready to fall from his horse, dark circles under his eyes, his body swaying slightly with fatigue. "I'll sleep when we're home," he said stubbornly. "Not before." "You're the most impossible man I've ever met, and you love me anyway." He said it without hesitation, without doubt, as though it were a simple fact like the sun rising or the desert being hot. Lydia felt warmth spread through her chest. "Yes, God help me, I do." They reached the ranch as the sun began its descent, painting everything in golden light. Tom had already started a fire in the stove, and the smell of coffee drifted from the house. Several neighbors had gathered. Word traveled fast in the territory, bringing food and congratulations. Even Sarah was there, having ridden out with Mrs. Brennan, both women beaming with pride. "You did it!" Sarah threw her arms around Lydia the moment she dismounted. "The whole town's talking about how you stood up to Magnus Sloane and won." "We won," Lydia corrected, looking at Colt, who was being helped down from his horse by Tom. "I couldn't have done it alone." Mrs. Brennan approached with unusual warmth in her stern face. "You've proven yourself, Miss Mercer. This territory needs women with your kind of backbone. Apache Junction is better for having you." The words meant more than Lydia would have expected. These people, her neighbors, her community, were accepting her not as the mail-order bride or the outsider, but as one of them, someone who'd fought for her place and earned it through courage and determination. The celebration lasted into the evening, but Colt excused himself early, stumbling toward the bunkhouse with Tom's steadying hand on his elbow. Lydia watched him go, torn between wanting to follow and knowing he needed rest more than anything else. "Let him sleep," Tom said quietly, reading her expression. "He'll be useless to anyone until he's had at least 12 hours. I'll keep watch tonight." "Tom, you've done so much already, and I'll do more, because that's what we do out here. We take care of our own." Tom smiled, a rare expression on his serious face. "You're one of us now, Miss Mercer. Better get used to it." After the neighbors left, Lydia stood on her porch looking out over her land. Her land. The word still felt surreal, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. But the solid wood beneath her feet was real. The cattle lowing in the distance were real. The life she was building here was real. She thought of Elijah Ward, the man she'd never met but whose generosity had given her this chance. She hoped he would approve of what she was doing with his legacy, hoped he'd be glad his ranch was in hands that would fight to preserve it. "Thank you," she whispered into the desert air. "I'll take care of what you built. I promise." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the usual Arizona heat already building by the time Lydia finished her coffee. Colt emerged from the bunkhouse looking somewhat restored, though still tired around the eyes. He found her in the barn, checking on the horses. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning. How do you feel?" "Like I rode to Tucson and back in one night." He moved closer, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "But seeing you here, Knowing the ranch is truly yours makes it worth every sore muscle. Lydia leaned into his touch, marveling at how natural it felt to be near him. How right. What happens now, Colt? We won in court, but Sloane's not going to just accept defeat. He spent too much time and money trying to get this land. No, he won't accept it easily. Colt's expression grew serious. Which is why we need to be smart about the next few weeks. He'll try something, he always does when he loses. But with the territorial marshal investigating and the judge's warning on record, he'll have to be careful. We just need to stay vigilant. For how long? Until he realizes you're not going anywhere, that this fight is going to cost him more than the land is worth. Colt's hand slid down to capture hers. But we're not going to spend every moment living in fear. We're going to rebuild the barn, work the ranch, build a life. That's how we win. By refusing to let him steal our future. Our future. The words sent a thrill through Lydia that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with hope. Colt, about us, she began, but he stopped her with a gentle finger against her lips. Let me say something first. Something I should have said weeks ago. He took both her hands in his gray eyes intense with emotion. I told you, I came west running from my past. That Catherine Thornton broke something in me I didn't think could be fixed. And that was true. But you... His voice roughened. You didn't just fix what was broken, Lydia. You made me want to try again, to believe again. You made me remember what it feels like to look forward instead of back. Lydia's throat tightened with emotion. You did the same for me. When I came west, I was running too. From poverty, from shame, from a life that had no room for me. But you showed me I wasn't just running away from something. I was running toward something, toward this place, this life, toward you. I love you, Colt said simply, not because you're convenient or because we're fighting the same battles. I love you because you're brave and stubborn and refuse to be broken. Because you see the best in people even when they don't deserve it. Because when you smile at me, I feel like I could do anything. Tears spilled down Lydia's cheeks. I love you too. Even though it's too soon and too complicated and probably too impossible. Nothing's impossible, Colt interrupted. We just proved that in court. Lydia Mercer, I want to court you properly. I want to take you to dances and church socials and make sure everyone in this territory knows you're mine and I'm yours. And when enough time has passed that it's respectable, I want to marry you, build a life here together, raise children who'll know what it means to fight for what matters. Yes, Lydia said without hesitation. Yes to all of it. Colt pulled her into his arms and kissed her, deep and thorough and full of promise. The kiss tasted like hope and new beginnings, like everything she'd been searching for without knowing it existed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. You know the town's going to talk. Let them talk. They've been talking about me since I arrived. I'm getting used to it. Good. Because I plan to give them plenty more to talk about. He kissed her again, shorter but no less intense. Starting with rebuilding that barn. We'll need it before the monsoon season hits. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal, despite the underlying tension of waiting for Sloane's next move. True to his word, Colt courted Lydia properly, sitting with her on Sunday mornings at church, walking with her through town where everyone could see, making his intentions clear to anyone who cared to notice. The gossips had plenty to say, but most of it was approving now. The mail-order bride had become the rancher who'd stood up to Magnus Sloane, and Colt Ashford was the cowboy loyal enough to ride through the night for her. Tom recruited 2 of his friends to help rebuild the barn, and soon the property rang with the sound of hammers and saws. Neighbors stopped by to lend a hand, bringing lumber and labor and the kind of community support Lydia had never experienced in Philadelphia. This was what frontier life meant, she realized, relying on each other because survival depended on it. Sarah visited frequently, ostensibly to help with cooking for the workers, but really to pepper Lydia with questions about Colt and romance and what it was like to be in love. Lydia found herself becoming something like an older sister to the girl, offering advice and companionship in equal measure. How did you know he was the one? Sarah asked one afternoon as they prepared supper. When you first met him, I mean. How did you know? Lydia considered the question carefully. I'm not sure I did know, not right away. I was too overwhelmed by everything else, losing Elijah, inheriting the ranch, trying to survive. But somewhere along the way, I realized that when things went wrong, Colt was the person I wanted beside me. Not because he could fix everything, but because he made me believe I could fix it myself. And when things went right, he was the person I wanted to share it with. That's how I knew. That's beautiful, Sarah sighed. I hope I find someone like that someday. You will, Lydia assured her. And when you do, make sure he's worthy of you. Don't settle for less than you deserve. But even as life settled into its new normal, the threat of Magnus Sloan hung over everything like a thundercloud waiting to break. His men were seen watching the property from a distance. Cattle went missing again, though in smaller numbers now that they kept constant watch. And the rumors filtering back from town suggested Sloan was planning something, though no one knew what. The answer came 3 weeks after the court hearing, on a hot afternoon when Lydia was checking the water channels with Tom. Riders appeared on the horizon, not Sloan's men this time, but the territorial marshal, along with Sheriff Cooper and several deputies. "Miss Mercer," the marshal said, dismounting with grave formality. "I'm Marshal William Hayes. I need to speak with you about Magnus Sloan." Lydia's stomach clenched. "Has something happened?" "You could say that. We've arrested Sloan and 5 of his men on charges of murder, attempted murder, arson, and cattle rustling. Jake Reeves turned state's evidence in exchange for a lighter sentence. He's provided detailed testimony about Sloan's activities over the past 5 years, including the murder of Elijah Ward." The world seemed to tilt. Lydia grabbed the fence post for support, her mind reeling. Jake Reeves confessed? Everything, names, dates, locations. Seems Sloan made the mistake of refusing to pay Reeves what he'd promised for the barn fire. Reeves got angry and decided cooperation was more profitable than loyalty. Hayes pulled out a notebook. "We'll need your testimony as well, Miss Mercer. About the intimidation, the threats, the stolen cattle, all of it." Colt appeared from the barn, drawn by the commotion. When he heard the news, something fierce and triumphant blazed across his face. "You're sure you can make the charges stick this time?" "With Reeves' testimony and the physical evidence we've collected, yes. Sloan's going to prison for a long time. Possibly hang, depending on how the trial goes." Hayes looked at Lydia with respect. "You stood up to him when no one else would, Miss Mercer. That took courage. And it gave other victims the courage to come forward too. 3 other families have filed complaints now that they know Sloan's power is broken." After the marshal left, promising to be in touch about trial dates, Lydia sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. It was over. The threat that had hung over her since the moment she'd arrived was finally truly over. Colt sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. She buried her face in his chest and cried, tears of relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming gratitude that she'd survived. "It's really over," she whispered against his shirt. "It's over," Colt confirmed. "You're safe. The ranch is safe. We can finally just live." The territorial trial of Magnus Sloan became the biggest news the Arizona Territory had seen in years. People traveled from across the Southwest to watch the proceedings, packing the courthouse in Tucson day after day. Lydia testified about the threats and intimidation, about watching her barn burn, about the constant fear of what Sloan might do next. Colt testified about Elijah's murder, about the pattern of violence he'd witnessed over the years. One by one, Sloan's victims came forward with their own stories of loss and terror. Jake Reeves' testimony was damning and detailed, laying out years of criminal activity with cold precision. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Magnus Sloan was sentenced to hang. Standing in that courtroom, watching the man who'd tried to destroy her being led away in chains, Lydia felt something shift inside her. Not triumph exactly, but a sense of justice finally being served. Elijah Ward would have his peace. The families Sloan had terrorized would have closure, and the territory would be safer for his absence. The ride back to Apache Junction took 2 days, and Lydia spent most of it in thoughtful silence. Colt rode beside her, giving her space to process everything that had happened, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand in silent support. "You're quiet," he finally said as they camped the first night, watching stars wheel overhead in the vast desert sky. Just thinking about how much has changed. 3 months ago, I was in Philadelphia with no future, no hope, no idea what my life would become. And now, she gestured at the desert around them, at Colt beside her, at the life she was building. Now I have everything I never knew I wanted. Any regrets? Colt asked. Lydia considered seriously. I regret never meeting Elijah. I wish I could have known him, told him how grateful I am for what he gave me. But regret coming west? Regret fighting for the ranch? Regret falling in love with you? She shook her head. Never. Not for a single moment. Colt pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Elijah would be proud of what you've done with his legacy. And I think... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I think he'd be glad you found someone to share it with. He wanted you to have a home and a partner. The fact that it turned out to be me instead of him doesn't change his gift. You really think so? I knew him, remember? He was a good man who wanted good things for the people he cared about. He cared about you, sight unseen, based on your letters and your heart, and he was my friend. I think he'd consider it fitting that I'm the one who gets to love you now. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire crackle and listening to the night sounds of the desert. Then Lydia spoke again, her voice soft but certain. Court me for 3 more months. Let people see that we're serious, that this isn't just convenience or reaction to everything we've been through. And then marry me, Colt Ashford. Make this official. Build this life with me for real. Colt turned to look at her, his gray eyes reflecting firelight. 3 months? Is that too soon? It's not nearly soon enough. But if that's what you need to feel right about it, then 3 months it is. He kissed her temple. Though I'm warning you now, I'm going to be the worst waiting fiancé the territory has ever seen. I'll be insufferable. Lydia laughed, the sound carrying across the desert. I'm counting on it. True to his word, Colt's courtship over the next 3 months was thorough, public, and entirely proper. He called on Lydia at her ranch with almost comical formality, bringing flowers he'd ridden miles to pick, sitting with correct posture on her porch while they talked about everything and nothing. He escorted her to every social function in Apache Junction, danced with her at the monthly barn dances, sat beside her in church, and made absolutely certain that everyone in the territory knew Lydia Mercer was spoken for. The ranch thrived under their combined care. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old one, bigger and sturdier than before. Tom hired 2 more hands as the herd grew, and Lydia's careful management of the water resources attracted notice from other ranchers looking to improve their own operations. She began teaching school 3 days a week in town, fulfilling the dream she'd mentioned in her letters to Elijah, bringing education to ranch children who'd never had access to formal learning before. And slowly, inevitably, Lydia and Colt built the foundation of a life together. They learned each other's habits and quirks, discovered how to work together through disagreements, found the rhythm of partnership that comes from shared purpose and mutual respect. The love that had blazed so bright in crisis settled into something deeper and more enduring, not less passionate, but more certain, like bedrock beneath desert sand. Sarah got engaged to a young rancher from a neighboring property, and she made Lydia promise to help plan the wedding. Mrs. Calloway started dropping hints about grandchildren and legacy. Even Mrs. Brennan softened enough to admit that she'd been wrong about Lydia's character, that the territory was lucky to have her. 3 months after Sloane's trial, on a crisp October morning when the brutal summer heat had finally broken into something almost pleasant, Colt Ashford and Lydia Mercer stood before Reverend Thomas in the small church in Apache Junction. The entire town had turned out for the ceremony, packing the pews until people spilled out into the yard, everyone wanting to witness the wedding of the mail-order bride who'd become one of them. Lydia wore a dress Sarah had helped her sew, simple white cotton with blue trim, nothing fancy but beautiful in its simplicity. Colt wore his best suit, his dark hair combed back, his gray eyes fixed on Lydia as though she were the only person in the world. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thomas began, but Lydia barely heard the familiar words. She was too focused on Colt, on the way he looked at her with such love and certainty, on the calloused hand that held hers with surprising gentleness. When it came time for the vows, Colt spoke his clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "I, Colt Ashford, take you, Lydia Mercer, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to stand beside you, to fight for you, to build a life with you that honors both where we've been and where we're going. I promise to love you not just in the easy times, but in the hard ones too. You made me believe in tomorrow again, Lydia, and I'm going to spend all my tomorrows proving I'm worthy of that gift. Lydia's voice shook slightly as she gave her vows, but she met Colt's eyes and spoke from her heart. I, Lydia Mercer, take you, Colt Ashford, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to match your strength with my own, to be your partner in all things, to love you fiercely and honestly for all the days we're given. You taught me that home isn't a place, it's the person who makes you brave enough to be yourself. You're my home, Colt, and I choose you today and always. Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, and when Colt kissed her, the church erupted in cheers and applause. But Lydia barely heard any of it. She was too busy holding on to her husband, this man who'd loved her before she'd even arrived, who'd fought for her when she had nothing to offer but hope, who'd shown her what it meant to truly belong. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and dancing and toasts that grew increasingly sentimental as the whiskey flowed. But eventually, Colt and Lydia slipped away, riding back to the ranch under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Mrs. Ashford, Colt said as they rode, testing out her new name. How does it sound? Perfect, Lydia said, and meant it. Everything about this is perfect. They reached the ranch to find lanterns lit and the house prepared, Tom's doing, leaving them privacy for their wedding night. Colt lifted Lydia down from her horse, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her up the porch steps and across the threshold of what was now their home. Welcome home, Mrs. Ashford, he said, setting her down gently in the small front room. Lydia looked around at the modest house that had once belonged to Elijah Ward, then to her alone, and now belonged to both of them together. Do you think he'd mind? She asked quietly. Elijah, I mean. That I married someone else in the house he prepared for me? Colt considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked about Elijah. I think he'd be glad you didn't let grief or guilt stop you from living. He wanted you to have a home and a partner and a full life. The fact that I get to be that partner, he pulled her close. That's just me being the luckiest man in the territory. That night, as they lay together in the darkness with the desert wind whispering outside and the future spreading out before them like an unwritten book, Lydia thought about the journey that had brought her here, the grief and fear and desperate hope that had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement, the shock of arriving to find her groom dead and her future in ruins, the slow, surprising discovery that sometimes the life you end up with is better than the one you planned. What are you thinking about? Colt murmured, his arm tightening around her. About how they called me a mail-order bride when I arrived, how that was supposed to be shameful, something to be pitied or judged. And now? Now I realize that title doesn't define me. I'm not just a mail-order bride. I'm a rancher, a teacher, a fighter, a wife. I'm Lydia Ashford, and I belong here. She turned to face him in the darkness. But you know what's strange? What? You called me yours before I ever left Philadelphia. In some letter Elijah must have shared, or some conversation you had about me. You knew I was coming, and in your heart you'd already claimed me, even before we'd met. Colt was silent for a moment, then he confessed quietly, I loved you from the moment you stepped off that coach, looking dusty and determined and trying so hard not to show how scared you were. But maybe you're right. Maybe some part of me knew you were mine even before that. Elijah used to read me passages from your letters, and I'd think, this woman sounds remarkable. I was half in love with you before you arrived. Meeting you just made it inevitable. So I was yours before I ever left town, Lydia said wonderingly. Before I even knew your name, I was already yours. And you always will be, Colt promised, sealing it with a kiss. The years that followed were the kind that make a life rather than a legend. Lydia's school grew from a handful of ranch children to a proper schoolhouse that served 3 counties. Colt expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land that came up for sale and building it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Tom eventually married Sarah and built a small house on the property, becoming Colt's true partner in managing the growing herd. Children came. First a daughter with Lydia's green eyes and Colt's stubborn chin, then twin sons with their father's storm gray eyes and their mother's quick intelligence, and finally another daughter who had auburn curls and a laugh that could light up a room. The house that had once belonged to Elijah Ward rang with the sounds of family, children playing, doors slamming, love and laughter filling every corner. Lydia taught her children to read before they could properly walk, filling their minds with stories and possibilities. Colt taught them to ride, to rope, to read the land and respect its power. Together, they raised children who knew what it meant to fight for what mattered, to stand up for what was right, to build something lasting through hard work and determination. Apache Junction grew around them. From a rough frontier town into a proper community with schools and churches and the kind of civilization that comes when people decide to stay and build rather than pass through. Lydia became one of the town's most respected citizens, known not as the mail-order bride, but as the woman who'd stood up to Magnus Sloan, who'd built a school, who'd helped more than one desperate woman find her footing in the harsh territory. And through it all, Colt remained her constant. The man who'd loved her first, who'd fought for her always, who'd built this life with her one day at a time. They had their struggles, of course. The territory was unforgiving, throwing drought and disease and financial hardship at them with depressing regularity. But they faced it all together, their partnership stronger for every challenge they overcame. 20 years after that courthouse victory over Sloan, Lydia stood on her porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch had never looked better. New buildings, healthy cattle, land that had been transformed through careful stewardship into something approaching paradise. Her children were scattered across the yard, the older ones helping with evening chores while the youngest chased chickens and laughed. Colt came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood like that often, watching their world together, comfortable with the silence of two people who'd said everything that needed saying long ago. "Do you remember the first time we stood here like this?" Colt asked quietly. "After the barn burned, after I'd ridden to Tucson and back, we watched the sunrise and I told you I loved you." "I remember," Lydia said. "I thought my world was ending. Everything seemed impossible." "And now?" Lydia turned in his arms to face him, studying the face she knew better than her own. Silver threaded through his dark hair now, lines bracketed his eyes and mouth. But to her he looked exactly as he had that first day when he'd met her at the stagecoach. Strong, certain, hers. "Now I know that nothing's impossible when you have the right partner," she said. "We built this, Colt. From nothing but hope and stubbornness, we built something real." "You built it," Colt corrected. "I just helped." "No, we built it together. That's what partnership means." Lydia reached up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "Thank you for teaching me that. Thank you for loving me when I had nothing to offer but letters and dreams." "You had everything to offer," Colt said fiercely. "Courage, strength, heart. You had all of it from the beginning. I just helped you see it." Their oldest daughter called from the barn that supper was ready, and they turned together to head inside. But before they reached the door, Lydia stopped one more time, taking a final look at the land that had become her home, the life that had exceeded every dream she'd had on that stagecoach 20 years ago. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Elijah had lived?" she asked softly, the question that had haunted her in those early days finally losing its power to hurt. What life would have been like if things had gone according to plan? Colt pulled her close, his arms strong and steady around her. "No," he said simply.
"But Sui."
"Because even before you left town, my heart already knew you were mine. Maybe Elijah brought you west, but I was always going to be the one who loved you. That was inevitable from the moment I heard him read your first letter, from the moment you stepped off that coach, from the moment our eyes met and I knew my whole world had just changed. You were always meant to be mine, Lydia. The only question was whether you'd be brave enough to claim me back." "And was I?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. "You were," Colt said, kissing her temple. "You're the bravest person I know. You came west to find where you belonged, and you found it. Not because someone gave it to you, but because you fought for it, built it, earned it. This land, this life, this family, it's all here because you were brave enough to want it." They walked into their home together, surrounded by children and laughter, and the life they'd built from dust and determination. And Lydia Ashford, who'd once been called a mail-order bride as though it were something shameful, knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She hadn't come west to be claimed by a cowboy. She'd come west to find herself, to discover her own strength, to build a life that was truly her own. That the cowboy had loved her from the beginning, had fought beside her, had chosen her every single day for 20 years. That was just the sweetest part of a story she'd never dared to dream. The desert wind whispered through the open windows, carrying the scent of sage and promise. And Lydia smiled, content in the knowledge that some journeys, no matter how they begin, lead exactly where they're supposed to. She'd answered an advertisement from a stranger, traveled 3,000 miles on faith alone, arrived to find her plans in ruins, and discovered that sometimes the life you end up with is infinitely better than the one you imagined. They called her a mail-order bride when she stepped off that coach. But Colt Ashford had called her his from the very beginning, and in the end, that was the only title that mattered. She was his, he was hers, and together they'd built something that would last long after they were gone. A legacy of courage, love, and the unshakable truth that home isn't where you come from, but where you choose to fight for, where you choose to stay, and where you choose to love. And every evening, as the Arizona sun painted the sky in colors too beautiful for words, Lydia would stand on that porch and remember the girl who'd arrived with nothing but hope and a satchel full of dreams. That girl had found everything she'd been searching for and more. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she'd been brave enough to reach for it, strong enough to fight for it, and wise enough to recognize love when it came calling her name. The end.